You walk down the shingle path that leads from the clustered longhouses to the water, and as you go, the evening begins to settle over the fjord in layers of grey and soft violet. The light has lost its sharpness, the sun already hidden behind the western ridge, leaving the sky a pale bowl of fading brightness. The shore stones are cool under your leather soles, worn smooth from years of feet and rain. You slow your pace without thinking about it, letting the quiet of the approaching night pull you into its own rhythm. Across the water, a low line of dark pines stands motionless, their tips dissolving into mist that hangs just above the surface. The sea is flat, a sheet of polished lead barely breathing against the rocky edge. A single seabird calls somewhere out in the haze, a long descending note that fades into nothing, and then there is only the hush of your own footsteps and the distant murmur of the workshop ahead. The workshop is a long wooden building set just above the high tide line, its roof a dark ridge of turf and bark that slopes down toward the beach. Smoke seeps from the hole in the roof peak, not in a column, but in a lazy drifting thread that curls and dissipates as if the building itself is breathing out the day's warmth. The door stands open, a wide rectangle of orange light spilling across the packed earth and the scattered chips of wood that lie like fallen leaves outside. As you come closer, the smell reaches you first, before the sight of anything inside, the deep, sweet, almost resinous scent of freshly worked oak, thick enough to taste at the back of your throat, mingled with the cooler smell of sea salt that clings to everything in this place and the faint tang of old smoke from the fire pit that never quite goes out. There is also the smell of damp wool from your own tunic, and underneath it all the clean, cold smell of the coming night air sweeping in from the fjord. You pause at the door for a moment, letting your eyes adjust, and the scent wraps around you like a familiar blanket. Inside, the workshop stretches back into a dimness that the firelight does not quite reach. 2 young apprentices are working in the far corner, their heads bent together over a pile of shavings that they sweep into wide, shallow baskets, with movements so practiced they have become automatic. The brooms they use are made of bound birch twigs that make a soft, steady whisk, whisk, whisk against the packed earthen floor, a sound that has been part of this building since the first keel was laid here. One of the apprentices, a boy with hair the color of dried grass, glances up as you enter but says nothing, his eyes meeting yours for a brief moment before returning to his work. The other, a girl a few winters younger, keeps her focus on the dust, her small hands guiding the broom in slow arcs. They are not in a hurry. There is nothing here that hurries. The fire pit in the center of the room holds a low, well-banked fire that burns with a steady orange glow, the flames licking around a thick chunk of driftwood that will last most of the night. A kettle of water hangs from an iron hook above the embers, not boiling, just keeping warm, sending up an occasional wisp of steam that joins the smoke overhead. You step inside fully and let your hands fall to your sides. The air is warm on your face after the cool of the shore, and you feel the tiredness in your shoulders and the back of your legs from the day's lifting and carrying begin to ease. The older shipwright, a man named Torsten, who has shaped more hulls than anyone can count, is standing at the far end of the workshop beside the great keel timber that arrived 3 days ago. He does not look up at you either. He is studying the wood, one hand resting on its rough surface, his thumb moving back and forth across the grain in a slow, absent-minded motion. The light from the fire throws his shadow long and wavering against the back wall, merging with the shadows of the hanging tools, the stacked planks, the coils of rope and leather strapping. You walk toward him, your footsteps quiet on the earth floor, and the warmth of the fire passes over you like a wave as you cross the center of the room. All around you, the tools of your trade hang from pegs driven into the heavy roof beams or rest in their places on low benches and shelves made of split logs. There is a row of adzes, their curved blades dark with age and use, the handles polished to a dull sheen by the grip of many hands. Above them, 3 axes of different sizes sit in a wooden rack, their edges catching the firelight in thin lines of silver. On a shelf near the door, a collection of wooden mallets stands like a small family, each one slightly different in weight and shape, their heads scarred from countless strikes against wedge and chisel. You know each tool by the feel of it, by the way it fits into your palm, and the particular sound it makes when it bites into oak or ash or pine. You could find any one of them in the dark just by reaching for it. The workshop holds them all in a quiet order, a pattern that has not changed since you first walked into this place as an apprentice yourself many winters ago. You come to a stop beside Torsten, and now you too look down at the keel timber. It is an oak log of remarkable straightness, nearly 40 feet long and as thick through as a man's chest, its bark still patchy in places where the tree's skin has not been fully stripped. The ends have been cut square with a large saw, and the cut surfaces show the rings of the tree, hundreds of them, each one a year of slow growth in some forest far up the coast. You can see the slight difference in color between the heartwood and the sapwood, the darker core giving way to a paler rim. The log still holds a faint smell of the forest, a cooler, earthier scent under the warmer smell of the workshop. You reach out and lay your palm on the wood, feeling the roughness of the bark where it remains and the smoother patches where the first rough shaping has begun. The wood is cool and solid, dense with the weight of its own long life. You press a little with your fingers, and of course the wood does not give at all. It is like pressing against the earth itself. Torsten moves his hand away and turns to look at you. His face is lined and weathered, the skin around his eyes crinkled from years of squinting into sea light, and his beard is a mix of grey and brown, neatly trimmed. He does not speak for a moment. He simply nods once, a small gesture that says everything that needs saying. You are here. The fire is lit. The wood waits. Then he gestures toward a long oak plank that rests on a pair of low wooden trestles near the fire, and you understand that this is where your hands will work tonight. You leave him there with the keel and walk over to the trestle, and the plank comes into focus as you approach. It is a plank about 15 feet long and a handspan wide, split from a log that was felled 2 summers ago and has been seasoning under the shelter of the roof ever since. The surface is still rough, carrying the marks of the wedges that split it, faint ripples and waves that follow the grain like the contours of a map. You can see the places where the wood split cleanly and the places where it fought a little, leaving small feathery edges that have dried hard and sharp. You run your hand along the plank from one end to the other, slowly, feeling the story of the wood under your fingertips. Here a slight curve in the grain, where the tree leaned toward the light. There a small knot, like a dark eye staring up at you. Further along, a patch of wavy grain, where a branch once grew and was absorbed back into the trunk. The plank is not perfect, but it is good. It is strong and straight enough for what it will become, a part of the ship's lower hull, the skin that will slide through cold water and keep the sea on the outside where it belongs. You pick up a small piece of charcoal from a clay dish on the nearest bench. The charcoal is cool and light in your fingers, leaving a faint black dust on your skin. You bend over the plank and begin to mark it, drawing slow, careful lines across the surface where you will work with the adze tomorrow. The marks are simple. A long curving line near one edge that will guide the bevel. A few short cross marks to show where the thickness needs to be reduced. You measure by eye and by feel, not by rule, because the wood tells you what it needs. The charcoal leaves a dark velvety line that stands out clearly against the paler oak, and you blow gently on the marks to clear away any loose dust, watching the tiny particles scatter and settle on the plank like a fine grey snow. Behind you, the apprentices have finished their sweeping and are now sitting on a low bench near the fire, sharing a small loaf of flat bread and a wooden cup of water. They talk in low voices, not whispers exactly, but words kept small out of respect for the quiet of the evening. Their conversation is a soft murmur that blends with the crackle of the fire and the occasional pop of a knot in the burning wood. You hear them mention the tide, the weather, the arrival of a boat from the next settlement over, but you do not listen closely. Their voices are just another layer of sound in the peaceful hum of the workshop. One of them lasts, a brief low sound that rises and falls away, and then there is the rustle of them settling back against the wall, pulling a wool blanket up over their knees. They will sleep here tonight, keeping the fire fed, as they do most nights when work is underway. You straighten up and stretch your back, feeling the muscles along your spine release. The firelight flickers across the walls, making the shadows dance slowly. You walk over to the shelf where the mallets are kept and pick one up, a medium-sized mallet with a head of dense birchwood and a handle worn smooth in the center from your own grip. You heft it in your hand, feeling its familiar weight, the way it balances perfectly just behind the head. You do not need it tonight, but holding it is a comfort, a reminder of all the planks you have shaped and the ships that have slid into the fjord one after another over the years. You set it back down on the shelf with a soft thud, the sound absorbed by the wood and the earth. Now you return to the fire and sit down on a low three-legged stool that creaks softly under your weight. The stool is old, its seat polished to a dark shine by the passage of countless hours and countless backsides. You rest your elbows on your knees and lean forward, letting the heat of the fire wash over your face and hands. The flames are hypnotic, their shapes constantly shifting and reforming, tongues of orange and yellow that reach upward and then curl back on themselves. You watch a single flame detach from the main body of the fire, flicker for a moment in the rising draft, and vanish into smoke. The driftwood log settles with a soft sigh, sending up a small shower of sparks that glow briefly against the dark roof before dying. The smell of burning wood is dry and clean, cutting through the heavier scent of oak that fills the rest of the space. Your mind drifts, not to anything in particular, just a slow loosening of thoughts like the uncoiling of a rope. You think about the shape of the ship that will grow from these timbers, the long, graceful curve of the keel, the rising sweep of the stem and stern, the overlapping planks that will form the hull like the scales of a fish. You see it in your mind's eye not as a finished thing, but as a gathering of potential, the way the wood already holds the ship inside it, waiting to be revealed. The sea will be its home, the same sea that whispers against the shore just outside the door, and you will have touched every piece of it with your own hands. The thought is not exciting, it is simply satisfying, the quiet satisfaction of a task that is worth doing and will be done well. Outside, the darkness has deepened, and the opening of the door now shows a rectangle of deep blue-black rather than grey. The mist over the fjord has thickened, and you can no longer see the pines on the far shore. A few early stars have appeared, faint pricks of light in the vast dome of the sky, and the air that seeps in under the door carries the cold, clean taste of the night. You pull your wool tunic a little closer around your shoulders and shift on the stool, finding a more comfortable position. The fire continues its slow, steady burn, and the workshop settles into an even deeper stillness, the kind of stillness that comes only when the work of the day is truly done and the night has taken hold. You think about the plank you marked and the work that awaits you in the morning. The adze will need sharpening before you begin. You noticed a small burr on the edge earlier, a tiny rolled-over bit of metal that will catch on the wood and tear rather than cut. Sharpening is a slow, meditative task in its own right. The feel of the whetstone in your hand, the thin film of oil, the steady push and pull of the blade across the stone surface. You will do that first thing, while the morning light is still grey and the workshop is quiet. Then you will pick up the plank, set it across your knees, and begin the rhythmic work of shaping, lifting the adze, and letting it fall with its own weight, over and over, until the rough surface becomes smooth and the charcoal lines are reached. It will take most of the day, and you will take breaks only to stretch your back and drink water and watch the slow progress of the sun across the open door. The thought is as comforting as a lullaby. One of the apprentices shifts in their sleep, a small sound of rustling wool and a soft exhale. You glance over and see that the girl has fallen asleep entirely, her head resting on a bundled piece of sailcloth, her face peaceful and slack. The boy is still half awake, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he stares into the flames, but he is not far from sleep either. You remember what it was like to be that age, to fall asleep in the warmth of the workshop with the smell of wood in your nose and the sound of the sea in your ears, and you feel a gentle kinship with them, a connection across the years that needs no words. You sit for a while longer, letting the night deepen around you. The fire is burning lower now, the driftwood log reduced to a glowing mass of embers that pulse with a deep internal red. The shadows have grown longer and softer, merging into one another so that the boundaries between objects blur. The tools on the walls are no longer distinct shapes but gentle suggestions, dark forms against a darker background. The keel timber, which you can just make out at the far end of the workshop, seems almost alive in the flickering light, its long shape like the spine of some great sleeping animal. You feel your own eyes growing heavy, the warmth of the fire seeping into your bones, and you know that soon you will rise and walk back up the shingle path to your own bed, to sleep under the same stars that are now scattered thickly across the sky. But for now, you remain. You let the quiet of the workshop hold you in its steady, patient embrace. The fire whispers to itself, the sea breathes outside the door, the oak planks wait silently on their trestles, holding the shape of the ship that is to come. There is nothing else that needs doing, nowhere else to be. The night is long, and the wood is patient, and so are you. You close your eyes for a moment, just a moment, and the darkness behind your eyelids is warm and soft and full of the scent of oak, and the sound of your own breathing becomes part of the gentle rhythm of the workshop, blending with the crackle of the embers and the distant hush of the tide. The world slows and you let it, and the night wraps around you like a tide that has no need to hurry. You are still sitting by the fire, the stool creaking softly under you as you shift your weight, and the embers have settled into a bed of deep orange that pulses with a slow, steady breath. The night outside has grown completely dark now, the rectangle of the door showing nothing but a soft blackness that might be sky or sea or both, and the cold air that slips under the door is sharp and clean against your ankles. Your hands are warm, resting on your knees, and your mind begins to drift away from the workshop, away from the marked plank and the adze waiting for morning, back through the weeks and months to a day in deep winter when you walked into the forest to choose the trees that would become these very timbers. The memory comes without effort, rising like the smoke from the fire, and you let it take you. It was a morning of pale silver light and air, so cold it felt brittle in your nose. You had woken before dawn, pulling on extra layers of wool and a heavy outer cloak of sheepskin that still carried the faint animal smell of the lanolin, and you had eaten a quick bowl of porridge, standing by the hearth in your own longhouse while the rest of the household slept on. The decision to go into the forest had been made the previous evening after a conversation with Torsten about the need for curved timbers, the natural bends and crooks of oak that would form the ribs of the new ship. Straight planks for the hull were one thing, split from the great boles of tall oaks, but the ribs that would give the ship its strength and its shape required something different. Trees that had grown at strange angles on steep slopes, limbs that had curved toward the light, trunks that had twisted slowly over decades into shapes that no human hand could improve upon. You knew where to find such trees, in a particular stretch of woodland on the far side of the fjord, a place where the ground rose steeply and the oaks had to fight for their footing. You gathered a small crew that morning, not a large party, just 3 men who had worked with timber all their lives and who understood the silence that the forest demanded. There was Hakon, broad-shouldered and quiet, who could swing an axe all day without tiring. There was Ulf, older than the rest, with a face weathered by decades of winter wind and a knowledge of wood that seemed to come from his bones rather than his mind. And there was a younger man named Asker, who carried the ropes and the extra tools and did whatever was asked of him without complaint. The 4 of you pushed a small flat-bottomed boat off the shingle and rowed across the fjord in the grey half-light of morning, the oars dipping into the water with soft, rhythmic plunks that left no echo. The surface of the fjord was glassy and still, broken only by the passage of your boat, and the mist clung to the shoreline in patches that shifted slowly as you passed. The cold sat on the water like a weight, and your breath came out in steady clouds that mixed with the mist and vanished behind you. On the far shore, you beached the boat on a narrow strip of pebbles and pulled it up above the tide line, securing it to a twisted root that jutted from the bank. The forest rose before you, a great dark wall of pine and bare-limbed oak that climbed the slope in tiers, the undergrowth frozen and silent. Snow had fallen 2 days before, not a heavy fall, but a dry, powdery layer that whispered under your boots and filled in the hollows between roots and stones. It was the kind of snow that preserves every track, every small movement of the forest creatures, and you noticed the delicate prints of a fox leading away into the trees, a line of neat punctures in the white surface. The air in the forest was different from the air on the water. It was stiller, heavier, with the scent of cold earth and pine resin, and it wrapped around you like a second cloak. You stood still for a moment, letting the forest accept your presence, and then you began to walk upward into the trees. The slope was gentle at first, but grew steeper as you climbed, and your pace slowed to the steady, deliberate rhythm that winter walking requires. You placed each foot carefully, testing the ground under the snow before committing your weight, and the others followed in your tracks, their breathing audible but not labored. The oaks in this part of the forest were old, their trunks thick and deeply furrowed, their bare branches spreading out against the white sky in intricate patterns that you studied as you walked. You were looking for curvature, for the graceful sweep of a limb that had reached out from a trunk and then turned upward, or for the subtle bend of a whole trunk that had leaned away from its neighbors in the slow competition for light. Ship ribs could not be straight. They needed to follow the natural lines of tension and compression that the tree had already learned, because wood that was forced into an unnatural curve would remember its straightness and fight against it, cracking or warping over time. The sea was a harsh mistress, and only wood that had already learned to bend would hold its shape against the constant working of the waves. After walking for perhaps an hour, you came to a small clearing on a shoulder of the slope, a place where the trees thinned out and the grey light of the sky fell directly onto the snow. Here, you found what you were looking for. A great oak stood at the edge of the clearing, its trunk not straight, but curved in a long, slow arc that began near the base and swept outward and upward, like the neck of a horse. The curve was perfect for a rib, the kind of shape that would take little more than smoothing and trimming to fit exactly into the growing skeleton of the ship. You approached the tree slowly, your hand already reaching out to touch the bark before you were even fully conscious of the gesture. The bark was rough and deeply grooved, a dark grey-brown that was almost black in the crevices, and patches of pale green lichen grew on the north side, spreading in slow circles like the rings inside the wood. You pressed your palm flat against the trunk and felt the solid, immovable mass of the tree, its roots plunging deep into the frozen ground, its crown reaching up into the grey sky. The tree had stood here for perhaps 100 years or more, through storms and summers and the slow creep of moss, and it would stand here for 100 more if you did not take it. But you had come to take it, and the forest understood this, and the tree, in its wordless way, offered no resistance. You drew your knife from your belt, a small blade with a handle of worn antler that fit comfortably into the curve of your palm. You turned the knife around so that the back of the blade, the blunt spine, was what you would use. Then you raised it and tapped the tree, not hard, but with a quick, firm motion, and you listened. The sound that came back was a clean, solid thwack, a sound that meant the heartwood was sound and free of rot. You tapped again, a little higher up, and then again, moving slowly around the trunk in a half-circle, while the others stood back and watched in silence. Each tap produced the same solid note, a confirmation of what your eyes had already told you. This tree was healthy, dense, and strong, full of the slow-grown rings that made the best timber. You knelt down in the snow and studied the base of the trunk, looking for any sign of fungal growth or splitting, and you found none. The tree was ready, and you were ready. The felling of a great oak in winter is a slow, patient art. You did not hurry because hurry leads to mistakes, and a mistake with a falling oak can crush a man or ruin the timber. You marked the direction of the fall first, choosing a line that would bring the tree down into the open clearing rather than into its neighbors, where tangled branches could cause it to hang and twist. You used your knife to cut a small blaze on the trunk at the height of your waist, a simple mark that showed the side you would begin cutting from. Then you and Hakon picked up the long-handled axes that Asger had carried up the slope, and you began the first cut. The axes were heavy, their blades honed to a fine edge that glinted in the pale light, and the handles were smooth from years of use, the wood dark where sweat and oil from many hands had soaked into the grain. You took up your position on the downhill side of the tree, and Hakon stood opposite you, and together you began to swing in a slow, alternating rhythm. The sound of the axes biting into the oak was a steady, repetitive chunk, chunk, chunk that echoed across the clearing and died away into the silence of the surrounding forest. With each swing, a thin curl of wood flew away from the blade, pale and clean and smelling of the cold sap that still lingered in the outer layers of the tree. You worked methodically, letting the weight of the axe do most of the work, your arms rising and falling in a pattern that your body knew so well, it required no thought. The cut grew deeper, a narrow notch that opened like a dark mouth in the side of the trunk, and the pale chips accumulated on the snow around your feet, a scatter of white on white. Every few minutes you paused to let the muscles in your shoulders relax, and during those pauses you listened to the forest, to the small sounds that filled the silence, the distant tap of a woodpecker, the rustle of a breeze in the pine needles overhead, the soft crunch of Ulf shifting his weight in the snow. Then you would raise the axe again, and the rhythm would resume. When the notch was deep enough, you shifted to the opposite side of the tree and began the back cut, a horizontal slice that would meet the notch and release the tension that held the tree upright. This was the moment of greatest care, the moment when you listened most closely to the subtle language of the wood. As the cut deepened, the tree began to speak, a low, deep creaking sound that grew louder and more insistent with each pass of the axe. This was the sound of the living fibers, stretching and beginning to tear, the sound of the tree's long life approaching its final breath. You did not push or rush, you let the tree tell you when it was ready. The creaking became a groan, the groan became a slow, drawn-out crack like distant thunder, and then the great oak began to move. It leaned, slowly at first, then faster, the crown sweeping through the air with a rushing sound that rose and rose, and then it hit the snow with a deep, shuddering boom that you felt through the soles of your boots and up into your chest. The branches shattered against the frozen ground, sending up a spray of snow and twigs and small splinters of wood, and then everything was still again, the silence rushing back in to fill the space that the sound had occupied. You stood for a moment in that silence, breathing hard from the exertion, watching the cloud of snow settle over the fallen tree. The oak lay stretched out across the clearing, its trunk now horizontal instead of vertical, its crown a mess of broken branches and scattered twigs. It looked different from this angle, longer and somehow more vulnerable, the curve that had reached up toward the sky now resting against the white ground. You walked along the length of the trunk, running your hand over the bark, checking for any unseen flaws that the fall might have revealed. But the wood was sound, the curve true, and the timber would serve its purpose well. You called to Ulf and Asger, and they came forward with the saw and the smaller hand axes to begin the trimming. Trimming the branches was a quieter, more delicate task than the felling. You worked your way along the trunk from the base to the crown, cutting away the limbs one by one where they attached to the main stem. Each branch was a small version of the whole tree, with its own rings and its own slight curves, and you noted which ones might be saved for smaller parts of the ship, the knees that would brace the deck, the smaller ribs near the bow, the pins and pegs that would hold everything together. Nothing would be wasted. The forest provided, and you honored that by using every part of the tree that could be used. The smaller branches and twigs you left on the forest floor, where they would rot over time and feed the soil, returning to the cycle that had nourished the oak in the first place. The hand axes made a softer sound than the great felling axes, a light tap-tap that punctuated your progress along the trunk. The cold air was sharp in your throat, and your fingers grew stiff inside your wool mittens, but the work kept your blood moving and your body warm. When the trimming was done, you stepped back and considered the log that remained. It was heavy, far too heavy to carry, and so you cut it into 2 sections using the long saw, a process that took the better part of an hour and left your arms aching. The saw made a rhythmic shush, 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 as it moved back and forth, the teeth biting into the oak and sending out a fine stream of sawdust that darkened the snow around your feet. Hakon worked the far end of the saw, and the two of you fell into the same steady rhythm that had driven the axes, a partnership that required no words, only the shared understanding of the task. When the cut was complete, the log lay in 2 pieces, each one heavy with the weight of the dense heartwood, but small enough now to be moved. You used ropes and long wooden levers to roll the logs down the slope to the shore. This was the slowest part of the work. A careful, incremental process of leverage and patience. You set the levers under the leading end of the first log and lifted, and the log rolled a few inches forward into the snow. Then you reset the levers and lifted again, and the log rolled another few inches. The snow helped, providing a slippery surface that reduced the friction, but still the progress was measured in handspans rather than strides. As the slope steepened, the log began to move more easily, and you had to be careful now, guiding it with ropes to keep it from rolling too fast or veering off into a tree. It slid down the final stretch with a low rumbling sound, ploughing a wide furrow in the snow, and came to rest on the pebble beach just above the waterline. The second log followed, and by the time both were safely at the shore, the short winter afternoon was already fading into early dusk. You loaded the logs onto the boat, weighting it down until the gunwales rode low in the water, and you made the slow crossing back to the settlement side of the fjord. The trip was heavier and slower than the morning crossing, the oars digging deeper into the dark water, and by the time you reached the familiar shore, the first stars were beginning to appear in the cold sky. You and the crew unloaded the logs and carried them up to the workshop, where Torsten had waited with a warm fire and a pot of broth, and you laid the oak sections down on a bed of smaller logs to keep them off the ground. The night closed around you, and the work was done. After that day, the logs were left to season under the shelter of the workshop eaves. You remember watching them through the months that followed, how the outer bark dried and cracked, how the exposed ends darkened from pale yellow to a deep, rich amber. The wood slowly gave up its moisture to the air, shrinking just slightly, tightening its fibers until it became stable and ready for the adze and the axe. The process could not be rushed. Rushing would only split the wood and ruin the natural curves that you had worked so hard to find. So the logs waited, and you waited, and through the rest of the winter and into the spring and summer, they rested under their covering, visited by the rain and the wind and the occasional mouse, until the day came when Torsten called for them and the shaping began. And now, on this night by the fire, the wood that had once stood tall on a snowy slope is here in the workshop, its journey from forest to fjord complete, its second life as part of a ship about to begin. You let the memory fade back into the quiet glow of the embers, and you feel again the steady pull of the present, the warmth on your face, the weight of your own tiredness, and the long, slow promise of the work that waits for morning. You wait before the apprentices, before the fire has been stirred back to life, before the first grey hint of dawn has touched the fjord. The workshop is dark except for the faintest glow from the banked embers, a soft red pulse that barely outlines the shapes of the hanging tools and the stacked timbers. The air is cold on your face and thick with the smell of old ash, a dry, powdery scent that sits at the back of your throat. You rise from the bench where you slept, pulling your wool cloak around your shoulders, and your breath comes out in small clouds that catch the ember light and vanish. The others are still asleep, Torsten on his pallet in the far corner, the two apprentices curled under their blankets near the cold fire pit. You move quietly, stepping around the scattered shavings and the low trestles, and you push open the heavy wooden door, just enough to slip outside. The morning meets you with a stillness so complete it feels like the world is holding its breath. Mist has settled thick over the fjord, a soft white blanket that erases the far shore and muffles every sound. The water you cannot see is absolutely flat, not a ripple reaching the shingle, and the only movement anywhere is the slow drift of the mist itself, shifting in layers of paler and darker grey. The air tastes of salt and cold stone, and the faint mineral tang of wet earth. You stand there for a long moment, letting the quiet seep into you, feeling the chill on your cheeks and the back of your neck. A single bird calls from somewhere inland, a thin high note that hangs in the mist and dissolves. Then silence again, deeper than before. You walk down to the water's edge and kneel on the wet stones, cupping your hands into the fjord. The water is so cold it stings your skin, and you splash it onto your face quickly, feeling the shock of it chase away the last threads of sleep. You drink a little, the water clean and faintly brackish, and then you stand and look out into the mist, though there is nothing to see except the soft grey curtain drawn across the world. The tide is low, exposing a strip of dark seaweed and barnacle-crusted rock, and the smell of the sea is stronger here, briny and clean. You turn back toward the workshop, your footprints leaving dark marks on the pale shingle, and by the time you reach the door, the sky has begun to lighten almost imperceptibly, the mist taking on a faint silver quality as the sun climbs somewhere beyond it. Inside, you rebuild the fire. You scrape the ash aside with a flat stick, revealing the embers that still glow at the core, and you feed them with dry shavings and small splinters of oak until a flame catches and grows. The fire crackles softly, a sound that seems loud in the quiet of the workshop, and the warmth begins to spread outward in slow waves. You hang the kettle on its hook and add fresh water from the bucket by the door, and then you sit for a moment on the stool, holding your hands out to the growing flames, letting the heat loosen the stiffness in your fingers. The light from the fire pushes the shadows back into the corners, and the workshop begins to feel like itself again, a place of work and patience rather than a dark cave of sleeping shapes. Today you will split the great oak log that has been waiting on its bed of smaller timbers since it was brought from the forest. The log is the one you felled on that winter day, the one with the slow curve in its trunk, and it has seasons through the spring and summer until its bark has dried and cracked, and its ends have turned a deep amber brown. Splitting a log of this size is not a task of force but of attention, a long, slow conversation between iron and grain. You gather the tools you will need and lay them out on the low bench near the log, a heavy mallet of dense birchwood, a set of iron wedges in different sizes, a smaller hand axe for starting the cleft, and a wooden club for tapping the wedges into place. Each tool has its own weight and balance, its own particular feel in the hand, and you know them as well as you know the lines on your own palms. The log rests on two cross timbers that raise it a foot off the earthen floor, enough to give you room to work along its full length. It is a section about 8 feet long and as thick through as your chest, the bark a dark, cracked landscape of ridges and furrows that catch the firelight in tiny shadows. The curve of the trunk is visible even now, a gentle sweep that will translate into the rib of the ship, the natural bend that will cut the hull planking and hold the sea at bay. You run your hand along the length of the log, feeling the texture of the bark, the slight roughness where a branch once grew, the smooth patch near the top where the outer layers have dried and begun to peel away. The wood is cool and solid, heavy with the weight of its own density, and it smells faintly of the forest still, a deep earthy scent under the drier smell of the workshop. You study the end grain at the top of the log, where the saw cut has left a flat surface marked with the rings of the tree. The rings are easy to read in the firelight, a series of concentric circles that widen outward from the dark heartwood at the center, each one a year of slow growth, of summer sun and winter rain, of the tree reaching deeper into the earth and higher into the sky. You trace the lines with your fingertip, feeling the subtle difference between the harder, darker latewood and the softer, paler earlywood. And you note the places where the rings are wider on one side than the other, showing how the tree leaned into the light on the slope where it grew. The grain is straight for most of the log's length, with only a slight twist near the top where a branch once grew, a small knot that you will work around. A good log for splitting, you think. A log that wants to open along its natural lines. You pick up the hand axe and the wooden club. The axe is small and sharp, its blade honed to a thin edge that glints in the light. You position yourself at the top end of the log and find the center of the rings, the dark heartwood that marks the oldest part of the tree. Then you set the axe blade along a faint line that runs radially outward, following one of the medullary rays that radiate from the heart, like the spokes of a wheel. These rays are planes of weakness in the wood, natural cleavage lines where the fibers are less tightly bound, and following them is the secret to a clean split. You tap the back of the axe head gently with the wooden club, not hard enough to drive it deep, just enough to start a small cleft, a narrow opening in the end grain. The sound is a soft thock thock, muffled by the wood and the mist outside. You tap again, and the cleft deepens slightly, a dark line opening in the pale wood like a crack in old ice. You set aside the axe and pick up the first wedge, a thin iron triangle with a flat back and a sharp leading edge. You fit the edge of the wedge into the cleft you have started, working it in with your fingers until it sits snugly, and then you pick up the heavy birch mallet. The mallet is solid and weighty in your hand, its head scarred from countless strikes, its handle polished to a dark shine. You raise it and bring it down on the back of the wedge with a single, steady blow. The sound is a deep, resonant thunk that travels through the log and into the earth beneath your feet. The wedge sinks a quarter-inch into the wood, and the cleft opens a little more, the crack extending a few inches down the length of the log. You strike again. The same steady motion, the same solid sound, and the wedge sinks deeper, the cleft stretching further, a dark fissure that follows the grain with a precision that satisfies something deep in your chest. You move along the log, a step at a time, following the progress of the split. Where the cleft stalls or threatens to wander away from the grain, you insert a second wedge, tapping it into the crack with the mallet until the tension releases and the split continues on its proper path. The wedges make a small family of iron shapes, some thick and blunt, others thin and sharp, each one serving a different moment in the process. You choose each one without thinking, your hand reaching for the right size before your mind has even named it. The mallet rises and falls in a slow, steady rhythm, and the crack grows longer, a dark line that traces the contour of the tree's inner life, revealing the pale, clean wood beneath the bark. The sound of splitting oak is not a single sound, but a sequence of small sounds that together form a kind of music. There is the thunk of the mallet on the wedge, a deep, wooden note, the creak of the fibers as they stretch and begin to separate, a sound like old leather being pulled, the sharp, clean crack when the split jumps forward a few inches, sudden but controlled, and underneath it all, the soft, almost inaudible sigh of the wood releasing the tension it has held for a century. You listen to these sounds as much as you watch the progress of the split, because the sounds tell you what the wood is doing, whether it is cooperating or resisting, whether the grain is straight or beginning to twist. A clean split makes a clean sound, a single note that rings true. A difficult split makes a muddled sound, a dull thud that warns of hidden knots or swirling grain. Today the wood is singing clearly, the notes ringing out in the quiet workshop, and you feel the satisfaction of good timber and good tools, and the slow, patient work of letting the tree become what it was always meant to be. Halfway down the log, you encounter the knot you noted earlier, the place where a branch once grew, and the grain swirls in a tight spiral around the dark core. The split slows here, the crack narrowing as it approaches the knot, and you pause to study the situation. A knot is a place of dense, twisted fibers, a memory of the tree's branching that hardened into a dark, resinous mass. Splitting through a knot is possible, but risks tearing the grain and ruining the plank. Better to work around it, to let the split follow the easier path and then trim the knot away later with a saw or a chisel. You insert a thin wedge just above the knot, tapping it gently to redirect the split, and you watch as the crack veers slightly, skirting the edge of the dark mass, following a softer line of grain that curves around the obstruction and continues on its way. The knot remains intact, a small dark island in the pale sea of the split wood, and you make a mental note to cut it out when the splitting is done. You continue along the log, step by step, wedge by wedge. The mist outside the door has begun to thin, the silver light growing stronger, and the shapes of the nearest pines are now visible as dark silhouettes against the grey sky. The apprentices have stirred, one of them tending the fire while the other fetches water, and their quiet movements are a soft background to your work. Torsten has woken too and is sitting on a stool near the fire, watching the splitting with the calm, appraising eye of a man who has done this 1,000 times. He says nothing, but his presence is a comfort, a reminder that the work you are doing is part of a long chain of hands and wood and ships that stretches back into a past no one can remember and forward into a future no one can see. The log is nearly split now, the crack running its full length from top to bottom, and the two halves are held together only by a few stubborn fibers at the far end. You move to the bottom of the log and set one last wedge into the remaining connection, tapping it with the mallet using shorter, lighter strokes. The fibers stretch and pop, one by one, a soft series of tiny snaps, and then with a final, gentle push, the two halves separate and fall away from each other onto the supporting timbers. The sound they make is a soft, heavy whomp as the flat inner faces hit the wood beneath, and then there is silence, the kind of silence that follows the completion of a long task. You set down the mallet and wipe your forehead with the back of your hand. The two halves of the log lie side by side, their inner faces exposed to the air for the first time since the tree was a sapling. The wood is a pale, creamy brown, almost golden in the firelight, and the grain runs in long, straight lines from end to end, with only the small knot interrupting the pattern. The surfaces are not smooth. They carry the slight ripples and waves of the split, the topography of the trees in a structure, but they are clean and true, ready for the adze and the smoothing and the long process of becoming planks. A faint steam rises from the freshly exposed wood, a thin wisp of moisture that carries the sweet, sappy smell of the oak's heart, and you lean close to breathe it in. It smells green and alive, despite the months of seasoning, a reminder that the wood is still a living thing in its own way, still changing, still breathing, still holding the memory of the forest inside its fibers. You step back and look at the two halves, and in your mind you can already see the planks they will become. Each half will be split again and then again, following the rays of the medullary grain until you have a stack of thin, straight boards, each one as strong and flexible as the tree intended. These planks will form the hull of the ship, overlapping one another in smooth curves that will shed the water and ride the swells. The curve that you saw in the standing tree will become the curve of a rib, the gentle sweep that cradles the hull and gives the ship its shape. Nothing is wasted, nothing is forced. The ship will grow from the wood as naturally as the branches once grew from the trunk. Torsten rises from his stool and walks over to you, his footsteps soft on the earthen floor. He looks at the split logs for a long moment, his eyes moving along the grain, his hand reaching out to touch the pale inner surface with the same gentle reverence you felt earlier. Then he nods, once, a small gesture of approval that carries the weight of his years and his knowledge, and he says something in a low voice about the quality of the timber and the cleanliness of the split. You nod back, accepting the quiet praise, and then he returns to the fire and his own work, leaving you alone with the wood and the growing light of the morning. The mist has lifted entirely now, and through the open door you can see the fjord stretched out in flat silver calm. The far shore, a dark line of pines under a pale sky. The sun is somewhere above the eastern ridge, not yet visible, but casting a diffuse light that fills the whole world with a soft, even brightness. A light breeze has picked up, barely enough to ripple the water, and it carries the clean smell of the sea into the workshop, mixing with the scent of fresh oak and wood smoke. You stand in the doorway for a moment, letting the cool air wash over you, feeling the pleasant tiredness in your arms and shoulders from the morning's work. The day is still young, and there is more to do, but for now you are content to stand and breathe and watch the slow movement of the water, the gentle rocking of the boats pulled up on the shingle, the distant figure of a fisherman mending his nets on the far shore. The world is quiet and calm, and the wood is split, and everything is as it should be. The two halves of the split log lie on the supporting timbers, their pale faces open to the air, and the morning light has strengthened into a clean silver white that fills the workshop from the open door to the back wall. The mist is gone entirely now, and the fjord is a sheet of hammered pewter stretching away to the dark shore beyond. You stand at the bench near the fire, a whetstone in your hand, and you turn the adze over to examine its edge. The blade is curved like a shallow smile, the steel dark with age but bright, along the cutting bevel where the light catches it. And as you run your thumb lightly across the edge, you feel a tiny rolled burr, a microscopic lip of metal that has turned over from the last use. It is barely visible, but your fingers know it the way a tongue knows, a loose tooth, and you know that it will tear the oak fibers rather than slice them cleanly if you do not take the time to sharpen it now. You sit on the low stool by the bench, the same stool you sat on last night, and you set the whetstone on your thigh. It is a flat, rectangular stone of fine grey grit, smoothed on one side from years of use and slightly rougher on the other, and it fits comfortably in your left hand. You pour a few drops of oil onto the stone from a small clay bottle, watching the oil spread in a thin, glistening film, and then you lay the adze blade flat against the stone at the correct angle. An angle you know without measuring, a tilt of the wrist that you learned so long ago it has become part of your body. You begin to move the blade in slow, steady circles, pushing it away from you along the stone and then pulling it back. The sound a soft, wet hiss that is the only noise in the quiet workshop, besides the crackle of the fire and the distant cry of a gull over the water. The rhythm of sharpening is a rhythm you could fall into and never leave. Each circle of the blade covers the full length of the stone, and with each pass you feel the burr being worn away, the edge refining itself, the steel growing keener and more eager. You pause after a dozen circles and hold the blade up to the light, squinting along the edge, and you see that the burr is gone, replaced by a clean, continuous line that gleams like silver thread. You test the sharpness by touching the edge to the hair on your forearm. The blade catches and lifts the hairs without pulling, a good sign. Then you flip the adze over and hone the back side lightly, just a few passes, to remove any remaining roughness, and when you are done, you wipe the blade clean with a scrap of wool cloth and set the adze aside, the whetstone going back into its place on the shelf. The plank you marked with charcoal the night before still rests on its trestles near the fire. You walk over to it and look again at the marks you made, the long curving line that will guide the bevel, the short cross marks showing where the thickness must be reduced. The charcoal lines are still dark and clear, slightly smudged in one place where you touched them, and you blow gently on the surface to clear away any dust that might have settled overnight. Then you lift the plank from the trestles, feeling its weight, the dense solidity of the oak, and you carry it to your shaping bench at the center of the workshop, where the light from the door falls brightest, and you can work without casting shadows on your hands. The shaping bench is a simple thing, a low wooden frame with a padded leather cushion for your seat, and a raised block at the far end where the plank will rest. You sit down on the cushion, feel the familiar give of the leather, and you settle the plank across your knees, one end resting on the block, the other end tucked under your left arm. The position is one you have held for thousands of hours, and your body settles into it without thought, your back straight but not stiff, your shoulders relaxed, your feet planted flat on the earthen floor. The adze lies on the bench beside you, its handle extending toward your right hand, and you pick it up and feel the smooth, warm wood of the grip settle into your palm, the balance point just behind the head, the weight of the tool pulling gently downward. You begin with the upper surface of the plank, the side that will face outward on the hull, the side that will meet the sea. The adze is designed to be used with short, controlled strokes, the blade dropping onto the wood and slicing away a thin curl with each pass. You lift the adze a few inches, letting the weight of the head do most of the work, and you bring it down at a shallow angle that peels away a narrow strip of wood, the blade making a soft, slicing sound, almost a whisper, as it cuts through the fibers. The chip that curls away is thin as a birch leaf and pale as cream, and it falls onto your lap and then to the floor, joining the scatter of shavings that already carpet the earth beneath the bench. You lift the adze again, move it a fraction of an inch to the right, and bring it down again. And another chip curls away, and another, the rhythm building slowly, a steady, unhurried tempo that matches the beating of your heart. The work of the adze is a work of tiny adjustments. You do not remove all the wood at once. You remove it layer by layer, stroke by stroke, reducing the rough surface of the split plank to a smooth, even plane that follows the charcoal line exactly. After every few strokes, you pause and run your fingers over the surface, feeling the subtle hills and valleys that remain, the high spots that need more attention, and the low spots that you must avoid. Your fingertips are as sensitive as your eyes, weeding the wood in a language of texture and pressure, and they tell you where to place the next stroke before your eyes have even registered the imperfection. You adjust the angle of the adze slightly, tilt the blade a little more, and take another thin shaving from a high spot, and when you feel the surface again, it is smoother, closer to the final shape. The sound of the adze is a quiet, rhythmic shush, shush, shush that blends with the other sounds of the workshop. The crackle of the fire, the distant tap of Torsten's mallet on a wedge at the far end, the murmur of the apprentices as they sort through a pile of offcuts, the occasional cry of a seabird over the fjord. The light through the open door shifts subtly as the morning progresses, a slow brightening that you notice only when you look up and see that the shadows have moved a handspan across the floor. The air is cool but not cold, the fire keeping the edge off the morning chill, and the scent of fresh oak sap hangs around your bench like a sweet fog, filling your nose with every breath. You work your way along the length of the plank, from the end near your body out to the far end on the block, and then you turn the plank around and work back the other way so that you are always cutting with the grain and never against it. Cutting against the grain would tear the fibers and leave a rough surface, a surface that would catch the sea and rot faster, and so you pay attention to the subtle direction of the grain lines, reading them the way you read the rings on the end of the log, following the gentle swoop and curve that the tree laid down over its long life. The grain on this plank is mostly straight, but near the knot you noted earlier, it swirls in a tight little eddy, and you slow your strokes there, taking lighter shavings, letting the adze find its own path through the twisted fibers. The knot itself you leave for later, when you will cut it out with a small saw and fill the hole with a plug of matching oak, a repair that will be invisible once the plank is planed and sanded. Time passes in the smooth, steady rhythm of the adze, and you lose yourself in the work the way you always do. Your mind empties of everything except the wood and the blade and the slow, incremental progress of the shaping. You do not think about the ship as a whole, or the sea, or the future. You think only about the next stroke, the next thin curl of oak, the next tiny adjustment of the blade. The world narrows to the span of the plank and the movement of your hands, and in that narrowing there is a deep, quiet peace, a stillness that is not stillness but motion, so steady and so practiced that it becomes a form of rest. Your breathing slows, matching the rhythm of the adze, and your shoulders relax even further, and your eyes half close, not from sleepiness, but from the comfort of a task that requires only attention and not thought. After a while, you pause to stretch. You set the adze down on the bench and stand up, feeling the pleasant ache in your lower back and the stiffness in your knees from sitting so long. You walk over to the door and look out at the fjord, and you see that the morning has given way to a full, pale noon. The sun is high but hidden behind a thin veil of cloud, and the light is diffused and even, casting no strong shadows. The water is still flat, a mirror of pale grey that reflects the sky so perfectly that the far shore seems to float on a sheet of glass. A small boat is out on the water, a fisherman checking his lines, his movements slow and unhurried, the oars dipping into the water with tiny silver splashes. You stand there for a few minutes, letting the cool air clear the oak dust from your lungs, and then you walk back to the bench and sit down again, the leather cushion creaking under you in a familiar way. You pick up the adze and resume your work, but now you shift your attention to the underside of the plank, the side that will face inward, the side that will be seen only by the men who row and the cargo they carry. This side does not need to be as smooth as the outer face, but it must still be flat and even, free of any splinters or rough patches that might catch on ropes or skin. You turn the plank over and settle it back across your knees, and you begin the same slow rhythm, lifting the adze and letting it fall, the blade biting into the pale wood with the same soft whisper. The shavings curl away from the inner face, and you notice that the wood here is slightly darker, closer to the heart of the tree, with a faint pinkish tinge that speaks of minerals drawn up from the deep soil. The smell is different too, earthier and less sweet, and you breathe it in deeply, the scent of the tree's secret interior, the core that was hidden for a century and is now open to the air. The apprentices come over to watch you work, standing a respectful distance away, their faces serious and attentive. The boy, the one with hair the color of dried grass, watches the movement of your hands with particular intensity, his eyes following the arc of the adze as it rises and falls. You remember being that age, standing in this very workshop, watching Torsten shape a plank and wondering how his hands knew where to cut and how deep. You learn by watching and then by doing. And you know that the boy will learn the same way, by standing here day after day until the rhythm sinks into his bones and his hands learn the language of the wood without his mind having to translate. You say nothing to him because there is nothing to say that the adze is not already saying, and after a while he and the girl wander back to their own tasks, their footsteps soft on the shavings. The afternoon wears on, the light beginning to take on the faintest golden tinge as the sun slides down the western sky. You have been working for hours now, and the plank is transformed. The rough, split surface is gone, replaced by a smooth, even plane that follows the charcoal lines almost perfectly. There are still a few high spots, a few places where the thickness is not quite uniform, and you attend to these with careful, light strokes, using the adze fine plane, taking shavings so thin they are almost transparent, the wood peeling away like the skin of a fruit. You check the thickness constantly, using a simple wooden gauge that you made yourself, a stick with a notch cut into it that shows the desired depth. You slide the gauge along the plank, and where the notch catches on a high spot, you mark it with a small dot of charcoal and then shave it down, repeating the process until the gauge slides smoothly from end to end without catching at all. When the plank is finally flat and true, you set down the adze and pick up a block of coarse sandstone, a rubbing stone that you use to smooth away the tiny ridges left by the adze blade. You rub the stone in long, even strokes along the length of the plank, following the grain, and the sandstone grinds away the high points with a soft, gritty sound, a shush-shush that is lower and rougher than the sound of the adze, but just as steady. The surface grows smoother under your hands, the faint ripples disappearing, the wood taking on a soft matte finish that feels warm and alive to the touch. You blow away the fine dust that accumulates, and you run your palm over the plank from end to end, feeling the smooth, even surface with a quiet satisfaction, a satisfaction that needs no words and no praise, only the knowledge of a task done well. The light through the door is golden now, the sun low enough to cast long, slanting beams that fill the workshop with a warm amber glow. Dust motes float in the beams, tiny specks of gold that dance and swirl in the still air, and the shadows stretch out long and soft across the earthen floor. Torsten has finished his own work for the day, and he sits by the fire with a cup of broth, his face peaceful and tired, his hands resting on his knees. The apprentices are sweeping the shavings into piles, their brooms making the familiar whisk, whisk, whisk that you have heard 1,000 times, the sound that means the workday is ending, and the night is coming on. You set the shaped plank back onto the trestles, standing it on its edge so that the air can circulate around it, and you step back and look at it for a long moment. It is a good plank, straight and strong, ready to become part of the ship's hull. Tomorrow you will shape another, and then another, until all the planks are done, and the time comes to fasten them together. But that is tomorrow. For now, you wipe the adze blade clean with a scrap of wool, hang it on its peg on the wall, and walk over to the fire to sit beside Torsten and take the cup of broth that he offers you. The warmth of the cup seeping into your hands, the taste of the broth salty and rich on your tongue. The day fades into evening, and the workshop settles into its nightly quiet, the planks waiting silently in the shadows, the sea breathing just beyond the door, and you are content. The keel timber has been waiting on its bed of stones near the water's edge since the day it was brought down from the workshop, a great oak beam, 40 feet long and squared on all 4 sides, its surfaces smoothed by the adze of the plane until they are flat and true. Today you will set it in place on the keel stone, the level bed of rock that has served as the foundation for every ship built on this shore, and you will begin the long, careful work of marking and measuring that will guide the rest of the build. The morning is cool and grey, the sky a single unbroken sheet of cloud that diffuses the light into a soft, shadowless brightness, and the fjord lies flat and still as a bowl of milk, reflecting nothing but the pale veil above. The light breeze stirs the grass along the upper bank and then dies away, leaving the air calm and quiet, the only sound the distant murmur of the settlement waking to its daily rhythms. You walk down from the workshop with Torsten and two of the other shipwrights, your footsteps crunching on the shingle in a slow, irregular pattern. The keel timber lies on a pair of low wooden rollers near the water, its dark oak surface beaded with the morning dew, the moisture caught in the tiny crevices of the grain and glinting faintly in the flat light. It is a heavy piece of wood, the heaviest single timber in the whole ship, and moving it requires care and patience and the combined strength of all four of you working together. You gather around the timber and take up your positions, two on each side, your hands finding the familiar grips along its squared edges, the wood cool and damp under your palms. Torsten gives a quiet word, not a command but a simple signal, and together you lift, the weight settling into your arms and shoulders with a deep, steady pressure. You shuffle sideways, step by slow step, the rollers creaking softly as the timber slides across them, and you guide the keel toward the stone bed that waits a few feet away. The keel stone is a large flat slab of grey granite that protrudes from the shingle like the back of a sleeping whale, its surface worn smooth by centuries of tide and weather and the passage of countless keels before this one. It sits just above the high water line, far enough from the sea to stay dry during all but the fiercest storms, and it is perfectly level, a natural platform that the first shipbuilders on this fjord recognized and used and passed down through the generations as a gift from the land itself. The stone is cold to the touch, even in summer, and it smells faintly of salt and the small dark lichens that grow in its crevices, a scent that is ancient and patient and utterly still. You help guide the keel onto the stone, the great timber settling into place with a soft, solid thump that you feel through the soles of your feet, and then you step back and look at it there. The backbone of the ship, the first piece of the great puzzle that will grow into a vessel capable of crossing the open sea. For a long moment, everyone is still. The keel lies on the stone in the grey morning light, its long, straight form a dart line against the paler shingle and the silver water beyond. It looks both immense and humble, a simple piece of shaped wood that holds within it the promise of everything to come. The stem and stern posts will rise from its ends, curving up like the neck and tail of a sea creature. The ribs will grow from its sides, branching out to form the skeleton. The planks will wrap around it, layer upon layer, until the ship is whole and ready for the water. But all of that is still ahead, still waiting in the wood and in your hands and in the long, slow days of work that stretch out before you like the fjord itself, calm and unending. For now, there is only the keel on the stone and the quiet morning and the first marks that you will make. You walk back to the workshop and gather the tools you will need for the measuring: a ball of linen cord, a lump of charcoal wrapped in a scrap of cloth, a small copper nail, a wooden compass with a sharp iron point, a plumb bob shaped from a smooth beach pebble and tied to a length of thin cord, and a measuring rod cut from a straight piece of ash and marked with shallow notchages at regular intervals. Each tool has its own weight and its own place in the order of things, and you carry them down to the keel stone in a shallow wooden tray that you set on the shingle beside the timber. The tide is just beginning to turn, the water lapping softly at the rocks a few feet away, and the sound is a gentle, rhythmic hush, hush, hush that will accompany your work through the morning and into the afternoon. You begin with the marking line. You take the ball of linen cord and unwind a length of it, stretching it from one end of the keel to the other to check that it reaches, and then you rub the cord across the lump of charcoal, working the black dust into the fibers until the whole length is dark with it. The charcoal leaves a fine powdery residue on your fingers, and you wipe your hands on the front of your tunic, leaving dark smudges that will wash out in the next rain. You and one of the other shipwrights take up positions at opposite ends of the keel, and you stretch the cord taut along the top surface of the timber, holding it exactly on the center line that you have already marked with a faint scratch from the tip of the measuring rod. You pull the cord tight, feeling the tension in your fingers, and you check that it is perfectly straight, not deviating by even a hair to the left or the right. Then you reach down with your free hand, lift the cord a few inches, and let it snap back against the wood. The sound is a sharp, clean thwack, and when you lift the cord away, a perfectly straight black line runs the full length of the keel, a line as true as the horizon where the sea meets the sky. This line is the center line, the spine of the ship, the reference point from which all other measurements will be taken. Every rib, every plank, every fastening will be positioned relative to this single dark mark on the pale oak. You run your fingertip along the line, feeling the faint grit of the charcoal, and you trace it from one end to the other, checking that it is not wavered or blurred. The line is sharp and clean, and you nod to yourself, a small gesture of satisfaction, and then you reach for the measuring rod and the copper nail. The copper nail is small, no longer than your thumb, with a flat head and a sharp point that glints in the grey light. You position it at the forward end of the keel, exactly on the center line, and you tap it gently into the wood with the flat of your palm, just enough to hold it in place. This will be the reference point for the stem post, the upward curving timber that will form the bow of the ship. You loop the end of a second length of cord around the nail and pull it taut toward the stern, measuring along the center line with the ash rod, checking the length again and again until you are certain. At the aft end of the keel, you drive a second copper nail, marking the position of the stern post, and you loop the cord around it, creating a baseline that stretches the full 40 feet of the timber, a thin, dark line suspended just above the wood, humming faintly in the breeze. Now the measuring begins in earnest. You pick up the wooden compass, its two legs joined by a tight leather hinge, and you set the iron point at one of the copper nails. You adjust the span of the compass until the other leg rests on the spot where the first rib will sit, a distance you know from memory and from the marks on the measuring rod. The compass creaks softly as you open it, the leather hinge stiff from the damp morning air, and you tighten the wooden screw that holds the legs in place. You walk the compass along the keel, stepping it from point to point, and at each position you make a small mark with the charcoal, a tiny cross that shows where a rib will be fastened. The marks form a steady, rhythmic pattern along the length of the timber, a visual echo of the ship's skeleton that will soon rise from this foundation. Between each rib position, you measure again with a rod, checking the spacing, making tiny adjustments. The work is slow and repetitive, and it requires a patience that you have learned over many years, a willingness to do the same thing over and over until it is exactly right. You do not rush, because a mistake here would travel through the whole ship, throwing off the symmetry of the hull, making the vessel pull to one side or sit unevenly in the water. The sea is unforgiving of small errors, and so you take your time, measuring twice and 3 times, walking the compass along the keel and back again, comparing the marks you have made against the rod and the cord and the image in your mind. The plumb bob comes next. You stand at the side of the keel and hold the cord between your fingers, letting the smooth beach pebble hang down toward the shingle. The pebble swings gently for a moment and then settles into perfect stillness, the point of it aimed directly at the center of the earth. You sight along the cord and check that the sides of the keel are perfectly vertical, that the timber has not twisted or settled unevenly on the stone. You move along the length of the keel, checking every few feet, and at each position the pebble tells the same story. The keel is true, the stone is level, the foundation is sound. You coil the plumb cord around the pebble and set it aside, and you feel a quiet sense of rightness, a sense that the ship is already beginning to speak through the wood, telling you that it is ready to be born. Torsten comes down from the workshop to inspect the work, his feet crunching on the shingle with a slow, deliberate pace. He walks around the keel, studying the center line, the copper nails, the charcoal marks that show the rib positions. He squats down at one end and sights along the length of the timber, closing one eye and tilting his head slightly, and then he stands and walks to the other end and does the same. His face is calm and unreadable, the face of a man who has seen 1,000 keels laid on this stone and who knows that the quality of the work speaks for itself. After a long silence, he nods, the same small nod that you've come to recognize as his highest form of praise, and he says something quiet about the spacing of the ribs and the straightness of the line. Then he walks back up the shingle, his figure growing smaller against the grey sky, and you return your attention to the timber. The next task is to carve the shallow notches where the ribs will sit. You select a small sharp chisel from the tool tray and a light wooden mallet, and you kneel down beside the keel at the first charcoal mark. The notch will be shallow, no deeper than the thickness of your thumb, and it will be angled slightly to match the flare of the hull, the outward curve that will give the ship its stability in the water. You position the chisel on the mark and tap it gently with the mallet, the blade biting into the oak with a soft, crisp sound, a sound that is somewhere between a click and a thud. A thin curl of wood rises from the cut and falls onto the shingle, pale against the grey stones, and you tap again, driving the chisel a little deeper, following the angle you have set in your mind. The notch takes shape slowly, a small rectangular hollow in the dark surface of the keel, and when it is deep enough you blow away the loose chips and test the fit with a scrap piece of oak cut to the thickness of a rib. The scrap slides into the notch with a snug, satisfying grip, and you nod and move on to the next mark. You work your way along the keel, notch by notch, the mallet tapping out a slow, steady rhythm that blends with the sound of the water on the shingle and the distant calls of the gulls. Each notch is a small work of attention, a tiny piece of the ship's skeleton given form in the wood. Some notches are angled more steeply than others, following the changing shape of the hull as it flares out from the narrow keel to the wider beam of the ship, and you adjust the chisel angle for each one, tilting your hand slightly, letting your eye guide the cut. The mallet handle is warm from your grip, and the chisel blade grows slightly warm from the friction of the cuts, and the smell of fresh oak rises around you in a sweet, clean cloud that mingles with the salt air. The tide has come in while you worked, the water now lapping just a few feet from the keel stone, and the surface of the fjord has taken on a deeper grey, the reflection of the clouds broken into soft, shifting patterns by the gentle swells. A pair of ducks paddle past, their wakes forming thin V-shapes that spread and fade, and you pause to watch them for a moment, their movements calm and unhurried, their heads dipping occasionally beneath the surface. The world is so quiet that you can hear the soft, wet sound of their bills breaking the water, and then they are gone around the curve of the shore, and you return your attention to the notches. When the last notch is cut, you stand up and stretch, feeling the stiffness in your knees and the small of your back. The keel is fully marked now, its dark surface dotted with the charcoal crosses and the pale hollows of the notches, a map of the ship that is to come. You walk slowly along the length of the timber, checking each notch one final time, running your thumb along the edges to make sure they are smooth and free of splinters. The oak is cool and solid under your touch, and the notches feel like they have always been there, like the keel grew them naturally, the way a tree grows the hollows where branches once attached. The work of the morning and the early afternoon is complete, and the keel is ready to receive its ribs. You gather the tools and return them to the workshop, wiping the chisel blade clean with a scrap of wool and hanging the mallet back on its peg. The fire in the pit has burned low, the embers glowing a soft, deep red, and the apprentices are sitting on the bench near the door, sharing a loaf of bread and a wedge of hard cheese. They offer you a piece, and you take it, the bread dense and slightly sour, the cheese sharp and crumbly on your tongue. You eat standing in the doorway, looking out at the keel on its stone, the long dark line of it against the grey water, and you feel the quiet satisfaction of a day spent in slow, careful work, a day that has moved the ship one small step closer to the sea. The planks that will form the hull have been shaped and smoothed, their surfaces flat and true from the work of the adze, their edges beveled to overlap one another in the long sweeping curve that will shed the water and ride the swells. But the hull of a ship is not a flat thing. It curves in three directions at once, flaring outward from the narrow keel, rising toward the stem and stern, and bending around the ribs in a shape that is as complex and organic as the body of a fish. To make a straight oak plank follow such curves without cracking or splintering requires heat and moisture and a patience that cannot be hurried. Today you will steam the planks, softening the wood fibers until they become pliable enough to bend into the shapes that the ship demands. The morning is still and grey, the cloud cover low and unbroken, and the air carries a faint chill that suggests the season is turning toward autumn. You walk down to the beach below the workshop, where the steaming setup has been prepared the day before. A great iron cauldron rests on a bed of stones above a long, shallow fire pit that has been dug into the shingle, its sides lined with flat rocks to hold the heat. The cauldron is old, its sides blackened with the soot of countless fires, and it is wide enough to hold several buckets of water at once. Beside it, a long wooden trough lies on the shingle, its inside lined with oiled sailcloth to hold the steam, and a pile of planks waits nearby, stacked neatly under a piece of coarse canvas to keep the morning dew from soaking into the grain. The sea is flat and quiet, the tide halfway out, and the only sound is the soft hiss of small waves retreating down the pebbles. You and the two apprentices begin by filling the cauldron with seawater, carrying wooden buckets up from the water's edge, the cold liquid sloshing gently against the sides of the pails. The walk from the sea to the cauldron is short, no more than 20 steps, and you make it again and again, the rhythm of the task settling into your body, like the rhythm of the adze. The bucket handles are smooth and dark from years of use, and the water they carry is cold and clear, with a faint greenish tint that speaks of the deep channels beyond the fjord's mouth. You pour each bucket into the cauldron, watching the water rise slowly up the blackened iron sides, and when it is deep enough to cover the lower half of a plank, you stop and set the empty buckets aside. The apprentices gather dry kindling from the pile under the workshop eaves, small twigs and splinters of oak left over from the shaping work, curls of dry bark that catch fire easily, and a few handfuls of dried moss that will serve as tinder. They arrange the kindling in the fire pit beneath the cauldron, building a loose nest of combustible material, and then one of them strikes a spark from a fire steel into a scrap of charred cloth, blowing gently on it until a small flame appears. The flame is pale orange in the grey morning light, almost invisible at first, and then it catches the dried moss and spreads quickly through the kindling, growing brighter and stronger until a steady fire crackles beneath the iron belly of the cauldron. Smoke rises in a thin, twisting column, grey against the grey sky, and the smell of burning oak fills the air, sharp and clean. The water takes a long time to heat. You sit on a flat stone near the fire, your hands resting on your knees, and you watch the flames lick around the base of the cauldron, their shapes constantly shifting and reforming. The iron absorbs the heat slowly, its black surface showing no change at first, but after a while a faint shimmer appears in the air above the water, a subtle wobble that means the temperature is rising. Tiny bubbles begin to form on the inner walls of the cauldron, clinging to the iron like silver beads, and they detach one by one and float up to the surface, where they pop with soft, wet sounds. The water begins to murmur, a low, rumbling sound that grows gradually louder, and steam starts to rise in thin wisps that curl and twist in the cool air. The smell of the steam is different from the smell of fresh water boiling. It carries a faint saltiness, a mineral tang that reminds you of the sea itself, and it mixes with the wood smoke in a way that is both sharp and soothing. When the water is boiling steadily, the surface roiling and churning, the steam rising in a thick white column that drifts away on the breeze, you select the first plank from the pile. It is a long, thin board of oak, perhaps 12 feet in length and an inch thick, its surface smooth from the adze and the rubbing stone. You run your hand along it, feeling the straight grain, the slight warmth of the wood, where the canvas has held the previous day's heat. This plank will become part of the lower hull, near the bow, and it will need to follow a gentle compound curve, bending upward to meet the stem post while also curving outward to accommodate the flare of the hull. You carry the plank to the trough and lay it carefully across the open top, not yet inside, just resting there while the steam gathers strength. The trough itself is a simple construction, a long wooden box made from old planks that have been repurposed from a previous project, their surfaces greyed and weathered by seasons of use. The inside is lined with a double layer of heavy sailcloth, the fabric dark with old moisture and stiff with salt crystals that glitter faintly in the firelight. The cloth hangs over the edges of the trough, ready to be folded over the planks once they are inside, trapping the steam and holding it close to the wood. At one end of the trough, a short wooden pipe connects to the cauldron, directing the steam from the boiling water into the confined space. The pipe is charred at the end and wrapped with strips of leather where it joins the cauldron, and a thin wisp of steam already escapes from the joint, curling away into the morning air. You lift the plank and slide it gently into the trough, laying it flat on the bottom, and then you select a second plank and lay it beside the first, and a third, until the trough is filled with a layer of pale oak boards. You fold the oiled sailcloth over the top of the trough, tucking the edges down securely, and you place a few flat stones on the cloth to hold it in place against the pressure of the steam. The cloth bulges slightly as the steam fills the space beneath it, and a soft, continuous hissing sound begins, the sound of hot, wet air working its way into the dense fibers of the oak, softening the lignin that binds the wood cells together, loosening the rigid structure that the tree builds over decades of slow growth. Steaming is a process that cannot be hurried. The wood must absorb enough heat and moisture to become pliable all the way through, not just on the surface, and this takes time. A thin plank like the ones in the trough will need perhaps an hour to soften sufficiently. A thicker plank might need 2 or 3. You sit down again on the flat stone by the fire, and you settle in to wait. The apprentices sit nearby, one of them whittling a scrap of oak with a small knife, the other staring out at the water with the unfocused gaze of someone who is not really looking at anything. Torsten is up at the workshop, working on the stem post, and you can hear the distant, rhythmic thud of his mallet drifting down the slope. The fire crackles and pops, the cauldron rumbles and steams, and the sea breathes against the shingle in its slow, eternal rhythm. The waiting is not empty time. You watch the steam rise from the edges of the trough where the sailcloth does not quite seal perfectly, thin fingers of white vapor that curl upward and vanish, and you gauge the temperature by the volume and speed of the steam, by the sound of the water boiling in the cauldron, by the way the wooden trough creaks softly as it expands with the heat. Every few minutes you rise and check the cloth, making sure it is still firmly tucked, adding a stone where a gap has opened. You listen to the hiss of the steam inside the trough, and you imagine the heat penetrating the wood, loosening the bonds between the fibers, preparing the plank to accept its new shape. After a while, you judge that the first planks are ready. You lift the stones from the sailcloth and fold it back carefully, releasing a great billow of steam that rises around your face, warm and wet and smelling of the sea and the oak and the deep, ancient forest. The planks lie in the trough, their surfaces dark with moisture, and when you reach in and touch one, the wood is almost hot to the touch, and it yields slightly under your fingers in a way that dry oak never does. You lift the first plank out of the trough, holding it at both ends, and it droops slightly in the middle, bending under its own weight with a supple, almost leathery flexibility. You carry the hot plank to the bending form that has been prepared near the keelstone. The form is a bed of shaped stones and heavy wooden blocks, arranged in the precise curve that the hull will follow. A curve that you and Torsten laid out weeks ago using the same measuring tools you used on the keel. The stones are grey and weathered, their surfaces worn smooth, and they have been used for this purpose on many ships before this one. The wooden blocks are wedged firmly into the shingle, immovable, their faces angled to support the plank as it bends. You lay the steaming plank against the form, and you and one of the apprentices begin the slow, careful work of coaxing it into its new shape. The bending is not a single dramatic movement, but a gradual, incremental process of gentle pressure and small adjustments. You start at one end of the plank and work your way along its length, pressing it against the form, feeling the wood yield under your hands, feeling the fibers stretch and compress in ways that would have been impossible an hour ago. The plank makes soft creaking sounds as it bends, sounds that are not cracks but sighs, the wood adjusting to its new position with a reluctance that gradually gives way to acceptance. Where the curve is tightest, near the bow end, you use a wooden lever to apply additional pressure, the lever braced against a stone and the plank, and you push slowly, steadily, waiting for the wood to tell you how far it can go. The steam still rises from the plank in thin wisps, and the warmth of it seeps into your hands, and the smell of the hot, wet oak is thick in your nose. When the plank is fully pressed against the form, following the curve from end to end, you secure it in place with heavy stones and wooden wedges trapping it in its new shape. You will leave it here to cool and dry, and as it cools, the lignin will harden again, locking the fibers into the curve that they have learned. The plank will remember this shape for the rest of its life, whether that life is spent in the hull of a ship or as driftwood on a distant shore. The tree that grew straight and true on the slope above the fjord has now become something else, something that curves and sweeps and will hold the sea at bay. You return to the trough and lift out the second plank, carrying it to the form and bending it into place beside the first, and then the third, and by the time the morning has turned to afternoon, a stack of curved planks lies on the form, each one shaped to fit its particular place in the hull. The planks will rest here for a day or more until they are fully cooled and set, and then they will be carried up to the keelstone and fastened into place. The process is slow and repetitive, but each repetition is slightly different, each plank requiring its own particular adjustment, its own degree of pressure, its own dialogue with your hands. The fire beneath the cauldron has burned low, the wood reduced to a bed of glowing embers that pulse with a deep, steady red. You add more kindling, feeding the flames, and you refill the cauldron with fresh buckets of seawater for the next batch of planks. The tide has come in while you worked, and the water now reaches almost to the edge of the fire pit, the small waves hissing against the hot stones and sending up tiny puffs of steam of their own. The sky remains grey and unbroken, the light diffuse and shadowless, and the world feels suspended in a moment of calm, a pause between the morning's labour and the evening's rest. You sit down again on the flat stone, your hands smelling of wet oak and salt, your shoulders tired from the lifting and the bending, and you watch the steam rise from the cauldron and the trough and the cooling planks on the form, 3 separate columns of white vapour that twist and merge and drift away on the breeze. The sight is peaceful, almost hypnotic, and you let your eyes go soft and unfocused, that the shapes blur into one another. Let the sound of the boiling water and the hissing steam and the gentle waves blend into a single steady hum. The ship is growing, plank by plank, curve by curve, and you are growing with it. Your hands learning the wood and the wood learning the sea. The curved planks have cooled and set on their bending forms, their fibers locked into the sweeping shapes that will define the hull. Now they must be fastened together, each plank overlapping its neighbour like the scales of a fish, held in place by iron rivets that will bind the ship into a single unyielding whole. The morning is cool and dry, the sky a pale washed blue with high streaks of cloud that catch the first golden light of the rising sun, and the shingle beach below the workshop has been transformed into an outdoor fastening yard. The keel rests on its stone bed. The first few ribs have been set into their notches and braced with temporary struts, and the lower planks have been carried down from the forms and laid alongside the hull in the order they will be attached. The air smells of cold stone and salt water and the faint, distant smoke of the smith's forge that has been set up just outside the workshop door. The smith is a man named Ina, broad-shouldered and silent, his hands permanently darkened by iron dust and his forearms mapped with the tiny scars of sparks that have landed on his skin over decades at the anvil. He has worked with the shipbuilders for as long as anyone can remember, travelling from the settlement's main forge whenever a new ship is ready for its fastenings, bringing with him the tools of his trade and the knowledge of exactly how each rivet must be shaped. His small portable forge is a compact thing, a clay-lined iron box raised on stone legs, with a goatskin bellows that breathes air into the charcoal with a soft, rhythmic whoosh, whoosh. The charcoal glows a fierce orange red at its heart, and the heat shimmers in the air above it, distorting the shapes of the workshop and the trees behind. Beside the forge, on a low wooden bench, Ina has laid out rows of iron rivets in different sizes, each one a small, square-shanked pin with a flat round head on one end, waiting for its rove and its final peening. You begin the day by sorting the rivets. You sit on a wooden block near Enar's bench, a shallow clay bowl in your lap, and you pick through the pile of iron pieces, grouping them by length and thickness. The shortest rivets, no longer than your little finger, will fasten the thin upper planks where the hull is lightest and the stresses are least. The longer rivets, some as thick as your thumb and as long as your hand, will bind the heavy lower planks near the keel, where the sea will press hardest and the ship must be strongest. Each rivet is slightly rough to the touch, the iron still carrying the faint ridges and hammer marks from its shaping, and they are cool and heavy in your palm, smelling of metal and charcoal. You drop them into separate bowls, the soft clink-clink of iron on clay, a steady, musical sound that punctuates the quiet of the morning. When the sorting is done, you carry the bowls down to the hull and set them on a flat stone near the keel, arranging them by size so that you can reach for the right rivet without looking. The first plank is ready to be fastened, a long, gently curving board that will sit just above the keel on the starboard side. You and one of the other shipwrights lift it into position, settling it against the ribs, checking that its beveled edge fits snugly against the keel and that its outer face follows the fair curve of the hull. The plank is heavy but manageable, and you hold it in place with a series of wooden clamps that you tighten by tapping small wedges into their jaws, the mallet making a soft, solid thunk-thunk against the wood. You step back and sight along the plank, checking that it runs true, that it does not dip or twist or deviate from the line you have marked in your mind. It is good, and you nod to yourself and reach for the bow drill. The bow drill is a tool you have used since you were an apprentice, a simple device of a wooden bow, a leather thong, and a straight spindle with an iron bit at its tip. You wrap the thong around the spindle, set the bit against the wood at the first rivet position, and begin to work the bow back and forth, the thong spinning the spindle with a soft whirring sound. The iron bit bites into the oak, and a thin curl of wood rises from the hole as it deepens, the drill working its way through the plank and into the rib behind it. The motion is steady and rhythmic, your right arm moving the bow, your left hand pressing down on the cap that holds the top of the spindle, and the drill makes a low humming sound that rises and falls with each stroke. The hole deepens, the resistance of the wood telling you when to slow down and when to push through, and after a minute or two the bit breaks through the inner face of the rib and the drill spins free. You withdraw the spindle and blow the wood dust from the hole, a fine pale powder that scatters on the air and settles on the plank like a dusting of snow. You drill the next hole, and the next, working your way along the plank, each hole spaced a handspan from its neighbour, the spacing measured by eye and by the marks you made earlier with a small awl. The drill makes the same sound each time, the same steady whir, the same soft bite of iron into oak, and the repetition is calming, a rhythm that your body falls into without effort. The morning light grows stronger, the sun climbing above the eastern ridge and spilling a warm golden glow across the shingle and the water, and the shadows of the ribs fall in long dark stripes across the inside of the hull. The fjord is still and blue, a deeper blue than the sky, and a light breeze stirs the surface into tiny ripples that flash and glitter like scattered coins. When all the holes are drilled along the first plank, you set aside the bow drill and reach for the rivets. You select one of the longer ones from the bowl, its square shank cool and solid in your fingers, and you push it through the first hole from the outside, the round head seating itself against the outer face of the plank with a soft tap from your palm. The shank protrudes through the inner face of the rib, a dark iron rectangle sticking out of the pale oak, and you reach for a rove from the second bowl. The rove is a small square washer of iron with a hole punched through its center, and you slide it over the shank, pushing it down until it sits flush against the rib. The fit is snug, the rove gripping the shank with a slight friction that holds it in place while you prepare to peen. You pick up the light peening hammer, a tool with a flat polished face and a short handle that fits neatly into your palm. You tap the end of the rivet shank gently at first, the iron mushrooming slightly under the blows, spreading outward to grip the rove and lock the whole assembly in place. The sound is a high, bright tink-tink, the sound of iron on iron, sharp and clean, and with each tap the rivet tightens a little more, drawing the plank and the rib together in a grip that will not loosen, that will hold against the working of the sea and the passage of years. You tap around the edges of the shank, shaping the mushroom evenly, and when the peening is done the rivet head is a neat, rounded dome that sits flush against the rove, and the plank is fast. You move on to the next rivet, and the next, the process repeating itself with small variations. Select the rivet, push it through, slide on the rove, tap it tight. The work is slow and methodical. each rivet taking perhaps a minute or two from start to finish, and there are many rivets to set along this one plank, and many planks to come after it. But you do not count them, and you do not hurry. You simply work, rivet by rivet, hole by hole, the rhythm of the hammer blending with the sound of Ina's bellows and the distant cries of the gulls and the steady hush of the tide on the shingle. The smith is working at his forge a short distance away, shaping new rivets to replace the ones you use. You watch him occasionally in the corner of your eye, the way he heats a length of iron rod in the charcoal, until it glows a bright, liquid orange, then carries it to his small anvil and hammers it into shape with quick, precise blows. The hammer rings out with a deeper, heavier note than your peening hammer, a bong-bong-bong that echoes off the workshop walls, and sparks fly from the hot iron in tiny, brilliant arcs that fade and die against the grey shingle. Einar works with the same unhurried patience that you do, his movements economical and sure, his face calm and focused. When a rivet is shaped, he drops it into a bucket of water, and it hisses and spits as it cools, the water bubbling around it for a moment before falling still. The morning passes into afternoon, the sun tracing its slow arc across the southern sky, the shadows shifting and shortening and then beginning to lengthen again. You have fastened 2 planks now, the lower strakes on both sides of the keel, and the hull is beginning to take on its true shape, the overlapping boards creating a smooth, continuous surface that curves in all the right places. You step back occasionally to look at the work, to run your hand over the rivet heads on the outer face, feeling their smooth, even domes, checking that none protrudes too far or sits too deep. The rivets form a neat, regular pattern along the planks, a line of dark iron dots that marks the skeleton beneath the skin. The apprentices bring water and a small lunch of flatbread and smoked fish, and you sit on the shingle near the keelstone to eat, your back against a sun-warmed rock, your legs stretched out in front of you. The food is simple and good, the bread dense and chewy, the fish salty and rich with the taste of the smokehouse. You drink from a wooden cup, the water cold and clean, and you watch the light play on the surface of the fjord, the way the breeze draws dark patches across the blue, the way the clouds above reflect as pale, drifting shapes. The other shipwrights sit nearby, eating their own meals in silence or talking in low voices about the work and the weather and the fishing. Einar has banked his forge and gone up to the workshop to rest, and the bellows are silent, the charcoal glowing a soft, steady red under its blanket of ash. After the meal, you return to the work. The afternoon is warmer than the morning, the sun stronger, and you feel a pleasant heat on your shoulders and the back of your neck as you bend over the hull. You take up the bow drill again and begin on the next plank, the one that will overlap the first, and extend the hull upward. The drilling is harder here, the angles more complex because the plank must be fastened not only to the ribs, but also to the plank below it, the rivets passing through 2 layers of oak before they reach the rib. You adjust the angle of the drill slightly, feeling for the right line, and when the bit breaks through, you test the alignment with a thin iron probe, checking that the hole runs straight and true through all the layers. The work requires more attention now, more small adjustments, but the rhythm remains the same. The steady whir of the drill, the soft thunk of the mallet on the clamps, the bright tink of the peening hammer. As the afternoon wears on, the sky begins to soften, the blue fading toward a paler, milkier hue as the sun slides down toward the western ridge. The shadows stretch out long and thin across the shingle, and the light takes on a golden honeyed quality that makes the oak planks glow with a warm, inner light. The iron rivets catch the sun and gleam like dark jewels, and the fjord turns to a sheet of rippled gold, too bright to look at directly. The air cools slightly, the breeze freshening from the west, and you smell the approach of evening, the faint scent of hearth smoke from the settlement above, the distant murmur of voices and the bark of a dog. You set the last rivet of the day, tapping the peening hammer in a final gentle series of blows, and then you set the tools aside and stretch, feeling the pleasant ache in your hands and arms and shoulders. The hull has grown taller, 3 strakes high on each side now, and the shape of the ship is unmistakable, the long, graceful curve of it rising from the keel like the body of a living thing. You walk slowly around the hull, checking each fastening, running your fingers over the rivet heads, feeling the solid, unyielding grip of the iron in the wood. Everything is tight and true, and you nod to yourself, a small, private gesture of satisfaction. The evening meal is being prepared up at the workshop, and the smell of barley porridge drifts down the slope, rich and savory, mingled with the sharper scent of dried fish warming by the fire. You gather the tools and carry them up to the workshop, wiping the iron bits of the drill with a scrap of oiled wool to keep the rust away, hanging the peening hammer on its peg, returning the remaining rivets to their bowls for tomorrow. Einar is banking his forge for the night, covering the charcoal with a layer of ash and closing the damper on the bellows, and he gives you a quiet nod as you pass, a silent acknowledgement of the day's shared labor. Inside the workshop, the fire pit has been built up into a cheerful blaze, and the long table near the back wall has been set with wooden bowls and spoons, and a great clay pot of porridge that steams gently in the firelight. The other shipwrights are gathering, their faces tired and peaceful, their hands washed clean of the day's dust and iron. You take a bowl and fill it from the pot, the porridge thick and creamy, studded with small pieces of dried fish and flecks of wild herbs, and you sit down on the bench near the fire, the warmth of the bowl seeping into your palms. You eat slowly, spoon by spoon, the porridge warm and filling, the taste of it simple and good. The fire crackles and pops, and the conversation around the table is low and unhurried. Stories of other ships and other seasons, small jokes and comfortable silences. Outside, the evening darkens, the fjord fading to a deep, soft blue, the first stars appearing in the high, clear sky. The day's work is done, the rivets are set, and the ship grows a little more each day, a little closer to the sea that waits patiently in the darkness, breathing against the shingle with a sound that is as steady and as ancient as time itself. The evening meal is finished, the bowls and spoons cleared away and washed in a bucket of fresh water, and the workshop settles into its nightly quiet. The fire in the central pit has been banked for the night, the embers raked into a tight mound and covered with ash, and the only light comes from 3 tallow candles set in iron holders on the workbench near the door. Outside, the fjord is a sheet of deep indigo, the sky above it pricked with the first hard points of starlight, and the air that slips under the door is cold and clean, carrying the faint mineral smell of the stones cooling on the shore. The other shipwrights have gone to their own longhouses, Torsten with a quiet nod, and Einar the smith with a small bundle of rivets, still warm from his forge, and you are alone in the workshop with the candles and the wood and the figurehead that waits for your hands. The figurehead is a block of oak that you set aside many weeks ago, a dense piece of close-grained hardwood cut from the crotch of a tree where a great limb branched away from the trunk. The grain there is wild and swirling, full of curls and eddies that would make it useless for planks or ribs, but perfect for carving, because the interlocked fibers hold together under the gouge and do not split along straight lines. The block is roughly the size of a man's head and shoulders, its outer surfaces still carrying the marks of the axe that roughed it out, and it sits on the bench before you, a dark, mute shape in the candlelight, waiting to become something more. You pull the stool close to the bench, sit down, and let the quiet of the night wrap around you like a second cloak. The 3 candles are made of rendered tallow, and they burn with a soft yellow flame that flickers and sways in the draughts from the door, sending long, dancing shadows across the walls and the roof beams. The light is not bright, but it is enough, a warm, intimate glow that pulls on the bench and leaves the corners of the workshop in deep shadow. The candles smell faintly of animal fat, a mild, slightly sweet scent that mixes with the dry smell of the oak and the cold air from outside. You arrange them carefully, one on each side of the block and one directly in front, so that no matter where your hands move, the light falls clearly on the wood and the blade. You unwrap the carving tools from their leather roll and lay them out on the bench in a neat row. There is a small curved gouge with a blade shaped like a crescent moon, its edge honed to a mirror polish. There is a straight chisel no wider than your little finger, good for cleaning out tight corners and defining sharp edges. There is a V-shaped parting tool that cuts 2 lines at once, useful for creating the illusion of scales or feathers. And there is your favorite carving knife, a short blade of fine steel with a handle of worn antler that fits into the curve of your palm as if it grew there. Each tool has its own weight and balance, its own particular way of meeting the wood, and you know them all intimately, the way a musician knows the notes of a flute. You pick up the block and turn it over in your hands, studying it in the candlelight. The shape you were looking for is already inside the wood, hidden in the grain and the mass, and your job is simply to remove everything that is not the figurehead. You close your eyes for a moment and picture it. A sea serpent, not fierce or threatening but calm and watchful, its body coiled in a loose spiral, its tail curling around a natural knot in the oak, its head rising from the center of the coil with eyes that are not fully carved, but only suggested, hinted at by the shadows of the surrounding wood. The serpent is a guardian, a spirit of the deep water that will watch over the ship and guide it safely through the waves, and it must look the part, ancient and patient and full of quiet power. You open your eyes and pick up the curved gouge. You set the blade against the top of the block, where the serpent's head will emerge, and you push gently, the gouge biting into the oak with a soft, crisp sound, a sound like a footstep in dry leaves. A thin curl of wood peels away from the blade and falls onto the bench, pale and delicate, and you turn the block slightly and make another cut, and another, the gouge working its way around the rough shape in a slow, spiraling path. The wood is hard and dense, the grain tight and swirling, and you adjust the angle of the gouge constantly, following the flow of the fibers, letting the tool find its own path through the tangled heartwood. The carving of a figurehead is a slow, gradual revelation. You do not cut deeply at first. You skim the surface, removing thin layers, feeling the shape begin to emerge under your hands like a form rising out of mist. The serpent's head comes first, a smooth oval that rises from the block, and you use the straight chisel to define the line of the jaw, the gentle curve where the mouth will be, the slight depression where the eye will sit. You work by touch as much as by sight, your thumb constantly stroking the surface, feeling the contours, checking the symmetry, reading the wood in a language of pressure and texture. The candlelight flickers across the emerging shape, and the shadows shift and dance, and sometimes you are not sure whether you are carving the serpent or the serpent is carving itself, using your hands as its instrument. The hours pass uncounted, the night deepening around you. The candles burn down slowly, their flames growing longer and more unsteady as the tallow pools around the wicks, and you pause occasionally to trim them with a small iron snuffer, pinching off the charred ends and watching the flame settle back to a steady glow. The workshop is utterly silent, except for the sound of your tools on the wood and the soft, distant hush of the sea on the shingle, and the silence is a comfort, a space in which the work can unfold without distraction or hurry. You are not tired, you are focused, your attention narrowed to the span of the block and the movement of your hands, and the rest of the world has fallen away into the darkness beyond the candlelight. The serpent's head takes shape under your gouge, the smooth, domed top of the skull, the slight ridge where the brow will be, the subtle hollow of the cheek. You use the small chisel to cut a fine line that defines the mouth, a gentle curve that is neither a smile nor a frown, but something in between, an expression of ancient calm. The eye is the hardest part, the part that will give the figurehead its spirit, and you approach it with particular care. You do not carve the eye fully. You create a deep-shadowed hollow, and then, within the hollow, you leave a small raised circle of wood that catches the light and suggests the pupil without defining it. The effect is subtle, a trick of the candlelight, and when you hold the block up and turn it slowly, the eye seems to watch you, to follow you, to hold a knowledge that is older than the tree and older than the sea. You set the head aside for a moment and pick up your knife, the antler handle warm from your grip, and you turn the block to work on the coiled body. The serpent's coils are suggested by the natural curves of the grain, and you follow them with the tip of the blade, cutting shallow, sweeping lines that spiral around the block, defining the overlapping curves of the body. The knife makes a soft, scritching sound as it cuts, a sound that is lighter and higher than the gouge, and the curls of wood it produces are fine as hair, curling away from the blade and falling onto the bench in tiny, delicate ringlets. You blow them away gently, watching them scatter across the dark wood of the bench, pale against the deep brown. The tail is the part that curls around the knot in the oak, the dark, dense eye of the branch that you left in place deliberately, incorporating it into the design. The knot is harder than the surrounding wood, almost like stone, and the knife blade skitters over it until you change the angle and approach it from the side, shaving away thin slices that reveal the dark, swirling grain within. The tail wraps around the knot in a loose, sinuous curve, and you carve small, shallow lines along its length to suggest the scales, using the V-shaped parting tool to cut two parallel grooves at once, the lines running in neat, diagonal rows that catch the candlelight and shimmer like water. You pause to sharpen your knife. The blade has grown slightly dull from the dense heartwood, and you reach for the small stone strop that sits at the edge of the bench, a flat piece of leather glued to a wooden board and charged with fine abrasive powder. You draw the blade across the strop in long, even strokes, the sound a soft whisk, whisk, whisk that is as familiar as your own breathing. You test the edge against the hair on your forearm, the blade catching and lifting the hairs with the faintest touch, and then you wipe the blade clean with a scrap of wool and return to the carving. The serpent's coils take shape slowly, the deep grooves you have cut creating a rhythm of light and shadow that moves as the candlelight flickers. You round the edges of the coils with the curved gouge, softening the transitions, making the body look smooth and muscular, as if it could uncoil at any moment and slide into the sea. The scales are only hinted at, a suggestion rather than a full covering, because you know that too much detail can crowd the form and lose the essential shape. The serpent is meant to be seen from a distance, from the deck of the ship or the shore, and its power must come from its silhouette, from the bold, sweeping lines of the coils and the calm, watchful head. The night is deep now, the stars outside the door so bright and numerous that they cast a faint silver glow on the shingle and the water. The air has grown colder, and you pull your wool cloak tighter around your shoulders, feeling the rough, warm fabric against your neck. You are not hungry or thirsty, but you pause to drink from a wooden cup of water that you brought from the bucket earlier. The water cool and clean on your throat, and you stretch your hands and flex your fingers, working out the small stiffness that has crept into the joints from holding the tools. You look at the figurehead with fresh eyes, holding it at arm's length, turning it slowly in the candlelight. The serpent is there now, unmistakably, its head rising from the center of the coil, its tail wrapped around the knot, its body a smooth, flowing spiral that draws the eye and holds it. There is still work to do, fine details to refine, rough spots to smooth, but the essence of the carving is complete. The serpent looks back at you from its dark eye, calm and patient, a guardian waiting to take its place at the prow of the ship, to watch the waves and the weather and guide the vessel safely through whatever seas it will travel. You pick up a small piece of fine sandstone, a rubbing stone, and you begin to smooth the carved surfaces, working the stone in gentle, circular motions that polish the wood without obscuring the detail. The sandstone makes a soft, gritty sound, a shush, shush, shush that is quieter than the adze or the gouge, and the wood grows satiny under your fingers, the grain emerging in rich, dark patterns that the candlelight picks out and blows upon. The serpent seems to come alive under the polishing, its curves deepening, its highlights brightening, its shadows growing more mysterious. You work on the figurehead through the last hours of the night, the candles burning down to stubs, the flames guttering and flickering as they consume the last of the tallow. When the final candle begins to die, you set down the rubbing stone and blow out the flame, and the workshop falls into a deep, velvety darkness that is softened only by the faint starlight coming through the open door. You sit in the darkness for a moment, the carved serpent resting in your hands, and you feel the shape of it, the smooth coils, the calm head, the solid, reassuring weight of the oak. It is done, or nearly done, and it is good. You wrap the figurehead in a piece of soft sailcloth and set it on the shelf above the bench, where it will be safe until the day comes to mount it on the prow. You gather the carving tools and wipe each one with the oiled wool, cleaning away the wood dust and the faint residue of sap, and you roll them back into their leather case with the same care you always use. The night is nearly over, the sky outside the door beginning to pale from black to deep grey, and you feel a quiet, bone-deep tiredness that is not exhaustion but the satisfying weariness of work well done. You lie down on the sleeping bench near the cold fire pit, pulling your cloak over you like a blanket, and you close your eyes. The image of the sea serpent still turning slowly in your mind, its calm eye watching over you as you drift toward sleep. The hull of the ship stands complete on its bed of stones above the tide line, every plank shaped and bent and fastened in its proper place, every rivet pinned tight against its rove, the long sweep of the vessel rising from the keel to the gunwales in a shape that is both strong and graceful. But between the overlapping planks there are narrow seams, the gaps where one board meets another, and these seams must be filled with a material that will keep the sea on the outside where it belongs. The work of caulking is slow and patient, a task that takes as long as the planking itself, and today you will begin it on the starboard side, moving from the stem at the bow all the way to the stern, sealing each seam with a mixture of warm pine tar and animal hair that has been used by shipbuilders on this fjord for as long as anyone can remember. The morning is cool and still, the sky a pale, even grey that promises no rain but no sun either, and the fjord lies flat and silver under the low clouds, its surface so calm that the reflections of the far hills are almost perfect, broken only by the occasional slow ripple from a drifting gull. You have set up your caulking station on the shingle just below the ship, a simple arrangement of a small iron pot hanging from a tripod over a low fire, a wooden bucket filled with cut wool and hair, a stirring stick worn smooth by generations of hands, and a set of caulking tools laid out on a piece of sailcloth. The tools are simple, a small iron caulking chisel with a flat blunt blade, no wider than your thumb, a wooden mallet for tapping it, and a thin iron hook for cleaning out any loose debris from the seams before you fill them. The fire crackles quietly, the flames licking around the bottom of the iron pot, and the smell of the burning driftwood mixes with the sharper, resinous scent of the pine tar beginning to warm. The pine tar itself comes from a stock that was rendered the previous autumn, a thick dark liquid that was slowly cooked from pine roots and stumps in a covered pit. The smoke captured and condensed into a viscous, sticky substance that smells of ancient forests and wood smoke and something almost sweet, like burnt sugar. It is stored in a large clay jar with a wooden lid, and you pour a generous amount into the iron pot, watching it settle in a dark, glossy pool that shimmers faintly in the firelight. As the tar warms, it thins slightly, becoming more fluid, and tiny bubbles rise from the bottom of the pot and pop on the surface with soft, wet, plinking sounds. The smell intensifies, filling the air around the station with a rich, heady aroma that clings to your clothes and your skin and will stay with you for days. While the tar heats, you prepare the hair. The hair comes from the settlement's sheep and goats, collected during the spring shearing and stored in coarse sacks in the workshop loft, and it is mixed with a little cow hair for added strength, the longer fibers giving the caulking its body and its ability to hold together under the constant working of the sea. You take handfuls of the hair and cut it into short lengths with a pair of heavy iron shears, the blades making a soft, rhythmic snick, snick, snick as they close, the cut hair falling into the wooden bucket in a pale, fluffy pile. You work slowly, cutting the hair into pieces no longer than your finger joint, and when the bucket is full, you fluff the mass with your fingers, pulling apart the clumps, mixing the different fibers together until they form a uniform, airy cloud that smells of lanolin and the faint mustiness of the storage loft. The tar is hot now, thin enough to stir easily but not so hot that it smokes, and you lift the iron pot from the fire with a hooked stick and pour it into the wooden bucket over the hair. The tar sinks into the fibers slowly, a dark, glistening stain that spreads and pools, and you take up the stirring stick, a length of ash that has been worn perfectly smooth by the grip of many shipbuilders over many years, its surface dark with old tar and polished to a dull sheen. You begin to stir, folding the tar into the hair with a slow circular motion, the mixture resisting at first and then gradually combining into a thick, sticky mass that is the color of dark chocolate and the consistency of warm dough. The stirring takes time. You turn the bucket with your free hand and work the stick through every part of the mixture, breaking up any clumps of hair, making sure that every fiber is coated and saturated. The sound of the stirring is a low, sticky schlup, 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 and the smell that rises from the bucket is so rich and so pungent that you can almost taste it on your tongue. When the caulking mixture is ready, you carry the bucket to the ship and set it down on the shingle beside the bow. You pick up the thin iron cleaning hook and begin at the stem post, working your way along the first seam between the garboard strake and the next plank above it. The hook scrapes gently against the oak, dislodging any small splinters or bits of wood dust that have accumulated in the gap since the planks were fastened, and you blow the debris away with a soft puff of breath, leaving the seam clean and ready. The gap is narrow, no wider than the blade of a knife in most places, and it follows the gentle curve of the hull, rising and falling with the shape of the planks. You take up the caulking chisel and the mallet. The chisel has a flat, blunt tip that is designed to push the caulking into the seam rather than cut the wood, and its handle is short and thick, fitting comfortably into your palm. You scoop a small amount of the tar and hair mixture onto the blade of the chisel, using your thumb to press it into a thin roll, and then you position the chisel at the start of the seam and push the mixture into the gap with a firm, steady pressure. The tar yields slowly, squeezing into the narrow space with a soft squelching sound, and you follow the pressure with a series of light taps from the mallet, the blows driving the caulking deeper into the seam, compressing it until it forms a tight waterproof seal. The sound of the mallet is a gentle thup-thup, softer and lower than the sound of the peening hammer, and it echoes back from the hull with a muffled resonance. You work your way along the seam inch by inch, the process repeating itself in a slow, unvarying rhythm. Scoop a little caulking onto the chisel, press it into the gap, tap it home with the mallet, then move the chisel forward a finger's width and do it again. Each tap pushes the mixture a little deeper, and as the tar cools against the wood, it stiffens, locking the hair fibers in place and forming a dense, elastic filling that will flex with the ship as it moves through the water. The seam slowly fills, the dark line of caulking standing out against the pale oak like a trail of black ink, and you run your thumb along the filled portion to check that it is flush and smooth, with no gaps or thin spots. Where the seam is wider, you add more caulking. Where it is narrower, you use less, your hands adjusting automatically, your mind drifting into the rhythm of the work. The morning passes in this steady, repetitive motion, the mallet tapping out its gentle cadence against the hull, the smell of the warm tar wrapping around you like a heavy blanket. The air is so still that the smoke from the fire rises in a straight, unbroken column, and the only sounds besides your own work are the distant cries of the gulls and the soft, endless hush of the tide on the shingle. You move slowly along the starboard side, the ship towering above you, its dark planks curving away toward the bow and the stern, and you pause occasionally to stretch your back and look out across the fjord. The low hills on the far shore are a muted green-grey under the overcast sky, their shapes soft and rounded, and the water between them and you is a sheet of unbroken silver, calm and patient. By midday you have filled the first seam from the stem post to the point where the hull begins to curve inward toward the stern. You climb down from the small wooden platform that you've been standing on and walk back to the caulking station to check the fire and stir the mixture in the bucket. The tar has cooled slightly, thickening again, and you set the bucket near the fire to warm it, the heat loosening the mixture and making it easier to work. You drink a cup of water and eat a small piece of bread, sitting on a flat stone with your back against the ship's hull, feeling the solid, unyielding presence of the vessel behind you, the smell of the oak and the tar and the sea all mingling together in a way that is deeply familiar and deeply peaceful. After the brief rest, you return to the work, starting on the second seam above the first. This seam is longer, running the full length of the hull from the stem to the stern, and it will take the rest of the afternoon to complete. You climb back onto the platform and begin again with a cleaning hook, scraping out the gap, and then you resume the rhythm of scoop and press and tap, scoop and press and tap. The mallet handle grows warm in your grip, and the muscles in your forearm develop a pleasant, steady ache that is not pain but the sensation of work being done, of progress being made. The caulking mixture in the bucket dwindles slowly, and you pause once to mix a fresh batch, heating more tar and cutting more hair. The familiar motions a small interlude before the main task resumes. As the afternoon wears on, the light begins to change. The grey overcast thins in the west, allowing a diffuse golden glow to spread across the sky, and the fjord takes on a warmer hue, the silver shifting to a pale bronze. The shadows under the hull lengthen, and the caulking chisel catches the light with each movement, the dull iron glinting faintly. You are working near the stern now, the seam curving upward as it follows the rise of the hull, and you adjust your position on the platform, leaning in closer to reach the higher gaps. The mallet taps on, steady and unhurried, and the seam fills behind you, a dark, continuous line that marks the boundary between the planks and promises a watertight hold. You pause near the stern post to inspect a section of the seam where the gap is slightly wider, a natural variation in the planking that requires a little extra attention. You take your time here, pressing more caulking into the space, using the chisel to pack it tightly, tapping with a few extra strokes of the mallet until the filling is firm and flush. Then you move on, the rhythm re-establishing itself, the scoop and press and tap carrying you forward along the final stretch of the hull. A light breeze springs up from the west, cool against your cheek, and it carries the smell of the open sea beyond the fjord's mouth. A fresher, saltier scent that cuts through the heavy aroma of the tar and reminds you of the voyages to come. When the second seam is complete, you step down from the platform and walk around to the bow to look along the starboard side. The two filled seams run the full length of the hull in smooth, dark lines, neat and even, following the curves of the planks without a waver. You run your hand along the lower seam, feeling the slight give of the caulking under your fingertips, the way it yields just a little and then springs back, sealing the gap with a grip that will only grow tighter when the ship takes to the water and the planks swell. The work is good, and you nod to yourself, the same small private gesture of satisfaction that has marked the completion of each stage of the build. The light is fading now, the golden glow in the west deepening to a soft amber and then to a dusky rose, and the line of hills on the far shore has turned a deep, shadowed purple, their outlines softening as the twilight gathers. You set the caulking tools on the sailcloth and cover the bucket with a piece of oiled canvas to keep the mixture from drying out overnight, and you bank the fire under the iron pot, pushing the embers together and covering them with ash. The smell of the tar lingers on your hands and your clothes, a smell that is sharp and sweet and deeply satisfying, and you walk down to the water's edge to wash your hands, kneeling on the wet stones and scrubbing with a handful of coarse sand until the stickiness is gone and your skin feels clean and cool. The first stars are appearing in the east, faint specks of light in the darkening sky, and the fjord has turned to a sheet of deep indigo, the surface barely moving, the reflected hills now a smudge of darker blue against the water. You stand for a moment at the edge of the shingle, looking at the ship that rises behind you, its long dark shape silhouetted against the twilight, the seams you have filled today invisible in the gathering dusk. Tomorrow you will caulk the port side, and the day after that perhaps the upper strakes, and then the deck planks if they need it. And then, when every seam is tight and every gap is sealed, the ship will be ready for the sea. But that is tomorrow, and the next day, and the days after that. For now, you turn and walk up the shingle toward the workshop. The sound of the tide soft behind you, the smell of the tar still faint in the cool evening air, and you feel the quiet, steady contentment of another day's work done. Another step taken on the long, slow journey, from tree to ship. The morning of the launch comes without ceremony, a day like any other day except for the one thing that makes it different. The ship is finished. You wake in the grey half-light before dawn, the workshop quiet around you, the fire pit cold and filled with white ash, the tools hanging in their places on the walls, the apprentices still asleep on their pallets with their blankets pulled up to their chins. The air is cool and damp, carrying the smell of the sea and the faint lingering scent of pine tar from the caulking that has now been finished for several days, every seam tight and waterproof. You lie still for a moment, listening to the soft breath of the sleepers and the distant hush of the tide on the shingle, and then you rise, pulling on your wool tunic and your boots, and you walk to the door and push it open. The fjord is a sheet of pale silver under the dawn sky, the water absolutely flat and still, the far shore a dark silhouette of pines against the lightening east. A thin mist hangs just above the surface, a low, drifting veil that shifts and swirls in the faintest breath of air, and the world is so quiet that you can hear the soft drip of dew falling from the workshop eaves onto the packed earth below. The ship rests on its bed of stones near the water, the long, graceful hull dark against the pale shingle, the stem and stern posts rising in smooth, confident curves, the figurehead of the sea serpent watching the fjord with its calm, patient eye. It has been ready for 3 days now, the final plank fastened, the final seam caulked, the final rivet peened, and it has waited through rain and sun and the slow turn of the tides while you and the other shipwrights made your final inspections and pronounced it sound. Today, it will meet the water. There will be no crowd, no speeches, no ritual, beyond the simple ancient act of sliding a vessel from the land into the sea where it belongs. The other shipwrights begin to gather as the light strengthens, emerging from their longhouses and walking down the shingle paths with their hands in their pockets and their breath making small clouds in the cool morning air. Torsten arrives first, his face calm and unreadable as always, and he stands beside you at the bow of the ship, looking up at the figurehead, his eyes moving slowly over the carved coils and the watchful eyes. He says nothing for a long moment, and then he reaches out and touches the serpent's head with the flat of his palm, a gesture that is both a blessing and a farewell, and he nods once, the same small nod that you have come to know so well. The other shipwrights gather around, Hakon the broad-shouldered, Ulf the weathered and wise, Asker the young and eager, and Einar the smith who has come down from his forge to see the result of all his rivets. The 2 apprentices are there as well, their faces bright with the excitement of the moment, though they try to appear calm and serious like the older men. No one speaks much. There is a shared understanding that words are not needed, that the ship itself says everything that needs saying. You all know what you have built, and you all know what it means, and the quiet of the morning is more fitting than any speech could be. The launch is prepared with the same patient care that has marked every stage of the build. You and the crew have laid a bed of greased logs on the shingle, running from the stone bed down to the water's edge, their surfaces slicked with rendered animal fat that glistens pale in the morning light. The logs are heavy and smooth, worn from use on previous launches, and they are arranged in 2 parallel rows that will guide the keel as it slides. At the water's edge, the shingle slopes gently into the fjord, and the tide is high enough that the ship will float free once it reaches the deeper water. You check each log, making sure it is aligned and secure, and then you walk around the ship one final time, running your hand along the hull, feeling the smooth planks and the tight seams and the neat rows of rivet heads. The wood is cool and damp under your palm, and it smells of oak and tar and the faint salt of the sea air, and it is ready. The crew takes up their positions around the hull. You and Hakon and Asger stand at the stern, where you will push, while Ulf and Einar and the apprentices take the bow, where they will guide the vessel and keep it aligned on the greased logs. Torsten stands back near the workshop door, watching with his arms folded across his chest, his eyes moving slowly over the ship and the crew and the water beyond. There is no countdown, no signal. There is only a shared moment of stillness, a pause in which everyone takes a breath and feels the weight of the ship and the moment and the long, slow journey that has brought them all to this point on this quiet morning. Then you lean your shoulder against the stern post, feel the solid, unyielding mass of the oak, and you push. The ship resists at first, the weight of it enormous, the friction of the keel against the first log holding it in place. You push harder, the muscles in your legs and back straining, and you feel the others pushing with you. A collective effort that is wordless and synchronized. There is a low, deep creak, the sound of wood beginning to move against wood, and then the keel shifts a fraction of an inch, and then another, and then the ship begins to slide. The movement is slow at first, almost imperceptible, a gradual surrender of the land to the sea, and the greased logs groan under the weight, a long, drawn-out sound that is not a protest, but an acknowledgement, a deep note that resonates through the shingle and up into your feet. The hull moves past you, the dark planks sliding by at the pace of a slow walk, and you keep pushing, your hands flat against the stern, guiding the vessel down the slope toward the water. The ship picks up speed slightly as it reaches the steeper part of the shingle, the greased logs doing their work, the hull gliding over them with a soft, continuous shush, shh, shh, just almost a whisper. The bow reaches the water first, the stem post cutting into the surface with a quiet rippling splash, and the fjord opens around it in a series of gentle, expanding rings that spread outward and fade. The water is cold and clear, and you can see the dark shape of the hull sliding beneath the surface, the submerged planks taking on a deeper, richer color, the oak drinking in the sea after its long season of waiting. The ship settles as it slides deeper, its buoyancy beginning to take hold, the weight of it lifting from the logs and transferring to the water, and by the time the stern reaches the edge of the shingle, the vessel is floating free. You wade into the fjord beside the ship, the cold water soaking through your boots and reaching your knees, but you do not notice the cold because your attention is on the hull. You run your hand along the submerged planks, feeling for any trickle of water, any sign that a seam has opened or a fastening has loosened. The seams are tight, the caulking holding firm, and the inside of the hull is dry. You climb up onto the deck, pulling yourself over the gunwale with the ease of long practice, and you walk the length of the ship from stern to bow, checking each seam from the inside, your eyes adjusting to the dim light under the deck planks. The oak has already begun to swell slightly as it absorbs the water, the fibers expanding to seal the gaps even tighter, and there is no leak, no seep, no sign that the sea has found a way in. The ship is watertight, and it is good. You sit down on one of the rowing benches near the center of the ship, the wood smooth and cool under you, and you let your hands rest on your knees. The ship moves gently under you, rising and falling with the small, slow swells that breathe through the fjord, and you feel the way it responds to the water, the slight rocking motion that is not unsteady but reassuring, the motion of a living thing that has found its element. The mist is lifting now, the sun climbing above the eastern ridge and spilling a warm golden light across the fjord, and the water around the ship shimmers with 1,000 tiny reflections. The other shipwrights have waded out and climbed aboard, and they move quietly around the deck, checking the rigging points and the oar locks and the stepped mast, their voices low and their movements calm. Torsten is the last to come aboard. He walks down the shingle slowly, his boots crunching on the stones, and he pauses at the water's edge, looking at the ship floating free for the first time. Then he wades out, the water reaching his thighs, and he pulls himself up over the side with a grunt of effort, the ship rocking slightly under his weight. He stands on the deck for a moment, his hands on his hips, his eyes moving over every part of the vessel, the curve of the hull, the set of the ribs, the neat lines of the rivets, the figurehead at the bow. He walks slowly forward and touches the serpent's head again, his fingers tracing the carved coils, and then he turns and walks back to where you sit on the rowing bench. He sits down beside you, the bench creaking under his weight, and he does not speak for a long time. Then he says very quietly that she is a good ship, a strong ship, and that the sea will welcome her. You sit together on the bench, the ship rocking gently beneath you, the sun warm on your faces, the fjord stretching out before you in a sheet of rippled blue. The other shipwrights have fallen silent too, each one finding a place to sit or stand, each one lost in their own thoughts. The apprentices are at the bow, looking out over the water, their faces full of the quiet wonder that comes from seeing something you helped build take its true shape for the first time. The mist has burned away completely now, and the sky is a pale clear blue, and the pines on the far shore are a deep, rich green. A light breeze stirs the surface of the fjord, and the ship rocks a little more, the motion a slow, soothing rhythm that is like the breathing of the world. You lean back against the gunwale and let your eyes half close. The new oak of the hull still holds a faint warmth from the days of sun it has absorbed, and when you press your hand against the plank beside you, you can feel that warmth radiating gently through the wood, a reminder of the forest and the fire, and the long, slow work of shaping and fastening and sealing. The ship is alive in its own way, a thing made of trees and iron and human hands, and it will carry this warmth into the cold seas it will cross, a small secret heart of heat held in the fibers of the oak. You think about the voyages to come, the distant shores and the open water, but the thoughts are vague and drifting, without urgency or detail, just a quiet sense of possibility that is as gentle as the rocking of the ship. The morning passes into noon, the sun climbing higher and the light growing brighter and warmer. Someone brings food down to the shore, and you all eat sitting on the deck, bread and cheese and dried fish, the simple provisions of a day of work. The tide begins to turn, the water lapping softly against the hull, and the ship swings slowly on its mooring line, pointing its bow toward the mouth of the fjord, as if it is already eager to begin its journey. But there is no hurry. The sea has waited for the ship, and the ship has waited for the sea, and now that they have met, there is all the time in the world. You stay on the ship through the afternoon, watching the light change and the shadows lengthen, and the fjord shift through 100 shades of blue and silver and gold. The other shipwrights come and go, some returning to the workshop to begin preparing for the next build, others lingering on the deck to talk quietly or simply to sit and feel the ship under them. The apprentices eventually fall asleep in the shade of the gunwale, their heads resting on coiled ropes, their faces peaceful and slack. Torsten remains on the bench beside you for most of the afternoon, not speaking, just being there, his presence as steady and reassuring as the ship itself. As evening approaches, the light softens to a warm amber, and the far hills turn purple against the darkening sky. You climb down from the ship and wade back to shore, the water cool around your legs, and you stand on the shingle and look back at the vessel floating on the quiet tide. It is beautiful, not in the way of jewels or gold, but in the way of things that are made well and truly, things that carry the mark of the hands that shaped them and the purpose for which they were built. The sea serpent at the bow watches the fjord with its calm, unblinking eye, and the ship rocks gently, a dark, graceful shape against the silver water, and everything is as it should be.